Hey guys, tonight we're going back to a time when mental illness wasn't called mental illness. It was usually called being cursed, possessed, or just plain unlucky. Welcome to the medieval world, where your inner turmoil might have earned you a spot in a monastery, or a locked basement. You probably won't survive this, but that's okay. We're not trying to live it, just understand it. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I love making these for you, and knowing who's listening really helps. Tell me your city and what time you're watching this too. Are we talking midnight vibes or 7 PM wind down? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You arrive in a village tucked into the folds of a forest that's just a little too quiet. The year is roughly 1250, give or take a decade, and the air smells like smoke, wet leaves and boiled onions. Life here is slow, damp, and full of superstition. Your neighbours believe the soul lives behind the eyes, and if those eyes ever look too wild or too blank, you might be possessed, or worse, touched by God in a way no one wants to touch back. Mental health, as we understand it today, doesn't exist. There's no psychology, no diagnostic manual, no awareness campaigns, just people. Confused, overwhelmed people trying to explain why someone's son won't stop screaming into the night, or why the widow next door hasn't spoken since her husband died in the last plague wave. They reach for the tools they have: religion, folklore, and a whole lot of fear. The church is your first stop. For most people, everything, weather, crops, illness, and your neighbour's hallucinations, is under God's rule. If someone's behaviour slips too far from the norm, the villagers assume it's divine punishment. Maybe they sinned, maybe their parents sinned, maybe the devil's poking around in their head like a bored cat. It's all tied together in a tangled web of morality and mysticism. There's comfort in that, weirdly. A bad thing must have a cause, right? But not everyone with what we'd now call a mental disorder was feared or shunned. Sometimes people just accepted it. If you were odd but harmless, you might be dubbed the village fool, or more gently, the innocent. It sounds like an insult, but in a strange way it could offer safety. Medieval communities sometimes carved out roles for people who didn't quite fit in, a kind of accidental neurodiversity. Still, not everyone was so lucky. If you had what we'd now call schizophrenia, epilepsy, bipolar disorder, or severe depression, things got darker. Much darker. You might be locked up, chained to a wall, paraded through the streets for public shame, or forced to undergo an exorcism. Especially if your symptoms included talking to unseen figures or hearing voices. That made you either a heretic or a holy person, and figuring out which was a risky guessing game. It didn't help that some people genuinely believed mental illness was contagious. Not through germs, they didn't know about germs yet, but through the soul. They thought madness could slip between people like a shadow under a door. So isolation wasn't just about control, it was a twisted form of protection. If you've ever wondered where the idea of padded rooms and distant wards came from, well, welcome to the prototype. And yet, buried under all the dread and ignorance, there were glimmers of something almost empathetic. In monasteries, for example, some monks believed that madness was a form of divine suffering. That meant they treated some mentally ill individuals with care, gentle voices, quiet routines, herbal medicines. They saw broken minds not as threats, but as mirrors of Christ's suffering. Of course, it depended heavily on which monastery you ended up in. Some were more compassionate than others. Others, well, you'd be better off in the forest. One strange little footnote from this era is how strongly people believed the phases of the moon affected behaviour. Lunacy comes from lunar, after all. Full moons were thought to stir the blood and disturb the soul. If you started pacing at night or speaking in rhymes, it might be blamed on the moon's tug at your inner waters. They didn't have tidal science, but they had the uncanny feeling that something in the sky was messing with their minds. And then there's the scholarly side, if you can call it that. The few educated people, monks, clerics, physicians, clung to the teachings of Galen, a Roman doctor whose work survived the collapse of the classical world. He talked about humours, 4 bodily fluids that needed to stay in balance: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Mental disturbance? Probably too much black bile. The cure? Could be bloodletting, a special diet, or a change in season. Yes, Sometimes doctors told you to wait until spring. Weirdly enough, some of this advice helped in roundabout ways. A change of scenery or routine can help a troubled mind. Herbal teas had calming properties, but it wasn't about science. It was about matching symptoms to pre-existing beliefs. A man sobbing uncontrollably wasn't depressed. He had a cold and damp imbalance in his humours. Simple as that. There's debate among historians over how widespread abuse really was. Were all people with mental illness mistreated? Or were they sometimes just absorbed quietly into the social fabric? Hard to say. The records we have are patchy and often sensationalised. Maybe some villages were kind, maybe others were nightmare fuel. The truth, like the medieval mind itself, is probably somewhere in between. So tonight, as you imagine walking through that moss-covered village, remember that every cry for help had to travel through a labyrinth of faith, fear, and folklore before it could be heard. And often, it wasn't. You step out into the night, past the flickering torches and wooden fences of the village, and tilt your face to the sky. It's clear tonight. Stars like splattered salt across black velvet. And there it is, the full moon. Bright, wide-eyed, and to the medieval mind, deeply suspicious. People believe this moon doesn't just light the night, it messes with minds, and you, standing under its glow, start to see why the legend stuck. They call it lunacy, and yes, that's where the word comes from. Luna, the moon, isn't just a pretty celestial rock, it's the alleged puppeteer behind madness, especially the kind that comes and goes like tides. If someone was perfectly calm for weeks and then one night tried to walk into the sea claiming they were Jesus, or started speaking in gibberish to a tree stump, the moon got the blame. People tracked its cycles almost religiously. A full moon wasn't just a time of heightened energy or strange dreams. It was when the veil between sanity and chaos thinned, and when someone snapped. Well, obviously they'd been moonstruck. In medieval Europe, especially from around the 11th to 14th centuries, the moon was thought to exert a kind of invisible pressure on the human body, especially the brain. They didn't understand gravity or lunar tides, but they observed patterns, livestock acting out, babies crying more, sleep growing restless, and the mentally ill having episodes. So naturally it must be the moon. The idea of a lunar influence wasn't fringe either. It was in the mainstream medical texts, written by learned men in flowing robes with names like Theodoric or Gerard. If your doctor told you the moon was at fault for your inner chaos, that was taken as seriously as someone today blaming your hormones or serotonin levels. There's something deeply human about the instinct to connect dots. We're wired to see patterns. You want to believe that the reason your cousin keeps whispering to invisible people, or your neighbour suddenly can't stop laughing during funerals, is because of something outside their control. Something you can predict, track, maybe even prepare for. That's what the moon offered. A way to make madness less random, less terrifying. But the moon wasn't the only scapegoat. People believed that madness could come from divine wrath. If you angered God, or if your father did, or your great-grandmother, or some drunk ancestor back in the day, the punishment could trickle down to you in the form of tormenting thoughts. Maybe you'd be plagued by visions. Maybe you'd feel the urge to self-harm or wander the countryside barefoot, ranting. These weren't seen as illnesses. They were seen as punishments, or worse, tests. That made treatment complicated. You couldn't just fix a divine punishment. You had to earn your way back into favour. That might mean fasting, whipping yourself with a branch, fun, confessing sins you didn't even remember committing, or going on a pilgrimage that could last years. One misstep, one little slip-up, and you might backslide into your suffering again. And yet, here's the twisted part. Some people envied those who were touched. If someone had vivid hallucinations or experienced what we'd call manic episodes, they were sometimes thought to be closer to God. Not everyone, mind you. This privilege was mostly reserved for people already seen as holy, like monks, nuns, or wandering prophets. If you were a peasant claiming to talk to angels, you were crazy. If you were a monk claiming the same, you might be canonized one day. Nice how that works. There was a widespread belief in divine madness, a state where someone appeared mentally unwell, but was actually receiving sacred knowledge. The idea came from ancient philosophy, but stuck hard in the medieval mind. Hildegard of Bingen, for instance, was a nun who claimed to see visions and hear divine music. She was widely respected and is now considered a saint. But picture this. If she'd been a farmer's wife instead of a cloistered nun with a knack for Latin, she might have been locked in a cellar instead. This division between divine insight and demonic possession was razor thin and completely subjective. How you were treated depended on your status, your gender, and whether the local priest was having a good week. It's one of the great injustices of the era, same symptoms, wildly different fates. There's even some evidence, though historians debate it, that people began to track their loved ones' episodes alongside lunar calendars. They would know when to hide sharp objects, when to chain someone up for their own safety, or when to call in a local priest to pray over them. No medications, no psychology, just timing, hope, and restraint. In this world, a full moon was almost a medical alert. And here's your fringe fact for the night. Some medieval texts describe moonstruck people as developing glowing eyes or enhanced strength during their episodes, like proto-werewolves. This wasn't just poetic description. Some actually believed the moon altered a person's very body. It gave rise to myths of night creatures, cursed souls who transformed under lunar pressure. Whether these stories were based on real individuals having psychotic breaks, or just good campfire lore is unclear. Either way, they fed the fear. One ongoing debate in scholarly circles is whether people in the Middle Ages actually believed these things literally, or whether some of it was metaphorical. Did they truly think the moon forced someone into madness? Or was the moon just an easier, safer metaphor than saying, we don't know what's happening to her, and it scares us? It's the kind of thing historians argue about over old manuscripts and weak coffee. So as you lay back, eyes half shut, imagine yourself in a wooden bed in a stone hut, the full moon casting a square of light on the floor. You hear a scream in the distance. Someone, somewhere, isn't sleeping. Maybe they're praying. Maybe they're battling unseen forces. Maybe the moon found them again. And you pull your blanket tighter, grateful it passed over you. This time, you wake up to the sound of chanting, low guttural Latin rising from the church at the centre of town. It's not Sunday, and there's no festival. Something else is happening. You slip outside, bare feet on cold stone, and follow the murmurs. The villagers are already gathered, forming a ring around a young man bound at the wrists with rope made of twisted flax. He's screaming, garbled words, half prayers, half threats, and his body jerks in spasms. Some cry, others watch in silence. A few make the sign of the cross like windshield wipers. You're witnessing an exorcism. This wasn't a once-in-a-generation event in the medieval world. Exorcisms, though not exactly common, were far from rare. The church had detailed rituals laid out for driving out demons, and many of them were aimed at people we'd now recognise as having severe mental illnesses. Schizophrenia, demonic possession, epileptic seizures, possession, suicidal depression, the devil whispering in your ear. You can see how it happened. The symptoms are sudden, scary, and difficult to explain, and when you don't understand something, it's tempting to frame it as a battle between good and evil. You watch as the village priest steps forward, holding a crucifix in one hand and holy water in the other. He begins to shout, not just pray, but demand that the demon reveal itself. He names saints, commands obedience, splashes the water with dramatic force. The young man snarls, actually snarls, and suddenly you're not sure where performance ends and possession begins. Does he believe it too? Maybe. When everyone around you says you're filled with evil, it's easy to become the part. You might start to believe that the things in your head really aren't your thoughts, that you've been hijacked. And here's the thing. Some people claim to feel better after an exorcism, not permanently, but for a time. Maybe the ritual provided a sense of structure, or maybe the sheer emotional intensity of it was cathartic. In a twisted way, it was a kind of therapy, loud, dramatic, and rooted in fear, but therapy nonetheless. You were seen, touched, spoken to, screamed at, and that was more than most people got. But more often, exorcisms went badly. Some ended in injury, others in death. The afflicted were sometimes beaten, restrained, or deprived of food and water for days, under the belief that weakness would make the demon easier to evict. Priests didn't act alone either. Families begged for interventions, communities pressured each other, and those who showed signs of recovery were praised, redeemed. Those who didn't, well, they were considered still tainted, dangerous. You see this clearly in the way people talk about evil spirits, not just metaphorically, but as real entities. Spirits that entered through sin, through bad dreams, or even through touch. You sit in on a whispered conversation between two women who swear that insanity runs like a river through bloodlines. One grandmother touched by a demon could mark an entire lineage. It's not medical history, it's spiritual stain, and it's forever. One case from the 14th century tells of a young girl who began having violent fits, screaming obscenities in voices that weren't her own. She was taken to a monastery where monks spent weeks trying to rid her of the so-called legion inside her. Starvation, cold baths, midnight prayers, even burning herbs around her bed. Eventually she stopped screaming. They called it a miracle. But some now wonder, was it a miracle or just trauma shutting her down? Exorcism wasn't exclusive to the Catholic Church either. Across medieval Europe, local healers and cunning folk practiced their own brand of demon cleansing. Some used charms, talismans, or bone fragments. Others performed rituals involving animals. Once, a chicken was made to peck at a possessed man's chest while chants were whispered over its back. Supposedly, the demon transferred into the chicken, which was then buried or burned. This was standard stuff in some regions. No one blinked. And here's your quirky fact for tonight. In some places, there were special saints believed to be particularly good at curing madness. People would travel miles to touch relics, bones, fingernails, a preserved tongue, hoping to shake loose the devil clinging to their thoughts. If someone got better, it confirmed the saint's power. If not, well, perhaps the demon was stronger than most. Or perhaps, as some darker corners of belief suggested, the sufferer liked the demon. That idea of secretly wanting to be possessed haunted people deeply. It meant that your pain was your fault. There's a lot of debate among scholars about how much of this was truly religious conviction and how much was social control. Was the church genuinely trying to help, or were they just maintaining order? Did the rituals serve spiritual purposes, or were they a way to keep the mentally ill out of sight and under control? It's likely both. Intentions weren't always malicious, but the outcomes often were. And then there were the false possessions. Although the term's a little unfair, people, especially women, would sometimes act possessed when they had no other way to express frustration, trauma, or mental collapse. Think about it. If you're in a society where speaking your mind is dangerous, where illness is invisible and emotions are censored, then screaming with a demon's voice might actually free you in a twisted way. People would listen, take you seriously. You'd be feared, yes, but also treated like something extraordinary. As you pull back from the crowd in the village square, the chanting fades, and you realise the ritual is over. The young man lies limp, eyes closed, a trail of holy water across his cheek like a second tear. No one claps, there's no celebration. Just quiet. The kind of silence that stretches, sticky and unfinished. You wonder what happens next. Is he healed, or just tired? You turn away, heart heavy, and walk home in the dark, wondering what it says about the world when the best option for mental distress involves being yelled at until you collapse. And yet, to them, it was hope. Twisted and loud and dangerous, but still hope. The next morning you find yourself walking toward the monastery on the edge of town. It's a low stone structure nestled into a hillside, its arched windows blinking in the early fog. You're here because, in this strange, complicated medieval world, monasteries sometimes served as the closest thing to a psychiatric hospital, though they wouldn't have used those words. In fact, if you were seen as mad, afflicted, or just dangerously odd, this place might be your only refuge, or your slow-motion prison. You push open the thick wooden door and step into the cool air of the cloister. It smells like old candle wax, parchment, and something faintly herbal, maybe rosemary or dried lavender tucked in the corners to keep away illness. A monk shuffles past in sandals, nods at you with a barely-there smile, and disappears into a side corridor. You follow the sound of humming, and eventually you reach a quiet inner garden where several figures sit on benches or pace in slow circles. These are the broken ones, as the locals call them. Some rock back and forth. One speaks to the clouds. Another simply stares into the fountain, his reflection trembling on the water like a ghost of who he used to be. They're not chained here, not beaten, not today. This monastery leans toward mercy, and in this place, mercy means routine. Clean robes, morning prayers, plain food, early nights. Some brothers believe that the soul, when disturbed, can be soothed by structure. That spiritual illness is real but not permanent. Others still whisper about demons, but more quietly. You sit beside an older monk who tells you they try to heal through quietude. He explains that madness isn't always a curse. Sometimes it's just a storm of the soul, and storms pass. They encourage the afflicted to work in the garden, copy verses, or simply rest in the silence. There's no medication, of course, but there's ritual, simplicity, and occasionally kindness. For some, it helps. Others remain lost. One of the strangest things about medieval monasteries is how deeply their approach to mental suffering varied. Some were surprisingly gentle, even progressive by the standards of the time. Others were brutal, cloaking cruelty in ritual. The treatment you received depended entirely on where you landed and who ran the place. There were no standards, no licensing boards, no watchdog groups, just belief. In some cases, monasteries were forced to take in the mentally ill because no one else would. Families would arrive at the gate, hands trembling, clutching someone who had become unpredictable or dangerous. "We can't help him," they'd say. "But maybe God can." The monks would accept them, not always out of compassion, but because they feared the consequences of turning away what might be a divine test. It was a catch-22 wrapped in scripture. You learn about one such man, Brother Alric, who arrived here years ago, long before his beard turned white and his voice began to fail. He had once wandered the roads naked, shouting at the sun, until a group of pilgrims brought him here. Over time he softened, stopped shouting. Now he tends the herb garden. He doesn't speak much, but when he does, it's often in lines of scripture, sometimes out of context, sometimes disturbingly accurate. He's considered healed, though no one really knows what that means. What's particularly fascinating is how medieval theology influenced this whole process. The dominant belief was that sin corrupted not just the soul, but also the mind. So the goal wasn't simply to restore mental clarity, it was to purge sin, even if the sin was imagined. Confession was a common requirement. Suffering was seen as purifying. You weren't just treated, you were refined through your pain. Forgiveness might come, but only after you'd been broken open and rebuilt. Sometimes, spiritual healing involved physically grueling practices, cold baths to shock the madness out, vigils that required staying awake for days, prolonged fasting, as if starving the body would also starve the illness. The logic was shaky, but the faith was strong. You couldn't argue with results, especially when survival itself was seen as divine approval. And then there were relics. Every good monastery had at least one, maybe a saint's bone fragment, a piece of cloth from a holy martyr, or even a vial of what was said to be Christ's tears. The mentally ill were often brought to these relics, placed beside them, encouraged to touch them or sleep near them. If they were cured, it was a miracle. If not, it was a test of patience or evidence of deeper sin. The logic looped in on itself like a snake eating its own tail. There's a fringe story you overhear in the scriptorium whispered by a younger monk while copying a manuscript. He says that once a man claimed to be haunted by the laughter of dead children. Everyone thought he was possessed, but instead of an exorcism, the abbot simply had him draw what he saw. Dozens of pages emerged, filled with crooked figures and unsettling eyes. And after that, the voices quieted. The drawings are gone now, burned most likely, but the story survives. It's one of the earliest hints that expression, not suppression, might be part of the answer. Modern scholars continue to debate whether these monasteries were closer to prisons or sanctuaries. Some argue that they preserved dignity where the outside world had none. Others point to records of abuse, neglect, and what we'd now classify as human rights violations. The truth probably lives in the cracks between, a well-meaning but deeply flawed system, built on the foundation of faith and fear. You rise from the bench in the garden as the bell tolls for midday prayers. The men around you begin to move, slowly but purposefully, like shadows returning to their places. And as you walk away from the monastery, you can't help but feel the weight of its contradictions, a place of both peace and penance, a shelter that sometimes saved, but just as often failed. That night, your curiosity drags you somewhere less holy. The monastery fades behind you, and instead, you find yourself approaching a castle. It looms in the distance like a sleeping giant, dark and brooding, with stone walls that seem to absorb light. But you're not here to see lords or knights, you're headed to the underbelly, literally. Deep below the castle, beneath the storage rooms and wine cellars, lies a place most people avoid unless absolutely necessary: the dungeon. And in some corners of medieval life, this is where the mentally ill ended up. The moment you descend the narrow stairs, the air thickens. It smells of mould, rusted iron, and something sour that might be despair or something worse. The torches flicker uncertainly, like even the fire is uneasy here. These aren't grand prison cells built with rights or dignity in mind. These are stone holes with iron doors, damp straw mats, and iron rings bolted into the walls. You pass by a cell where a man is shackled to the floor, humming to himself. Another moans rhythmically, his back to you, face pressed into the stone. Welcome to one of the medieval world's worst-kept secrets: the cellar as asylum. Not every mentally ill person ended up here, but those who did were often the ones who frightened others. If someone became aggressive, unpredictable, or simply too strange to be explained away with moon phases or bad humours, they were sometimes locked up for safety. Whose safety? That was up for debate. Sometimes it was their own, more often it was everyone else's. The tools here are horrifying in their simplicity: shackles, gags, cages, cold water dousing, iron helmets. Not to punish, at least not officially, but to restrain and subdue. There's no medical knowledge behind it, just a single blunted concept: control. Keep them still, keep them quiet. If they're screaming, tie their mouth. If they won't stop running, chain their leg. It's problem solving by brute force, all dressed up in stone and silence. One of the more disturbing truths is how often mental illness and criminal behaviour were lumped together. If you heard voices and attacked someone because of them, that wasn't illness. It was evil. And while some towns had madhouses or even rudimentary hospital-like buildings, most didn't. So the mentally ill were crammed into cells alongside thieves, murderers, and rebels. No distinction, no therapy, just chains. Some dungeons developed a reputation for keeping the mad long after everyone else had been released. Because even when the crime was vague, disturbing the peace, uncontrollable raving, talking to invisible beasts, the sentence could be indefinite. The only hope of freedom came when your behaviour changed, and for many suffering serious mental conditions that never happened. There's an especially grim case from the 13th century in Flanders involving a woman who believed she'd swallowed the devil. She became violently ill and refused to eat, convinced that feeding herself would only make the demon stronger. Rather than attempt to understand or treat her delusion, she was placed in a cellar beneath the city hall and left in isolation. Months passed. When they finally checked on her again, she was catatonic. The devil hadn't left, but everything else had. And here's the fringe fact of the night. In some cases, people were intentionally placed in dungeons as part of spiritual penance, even if they weren't mentally ill. Voluntary isolation, complete with chains, was considered a holy act, a way to suffer alongside Christ. So sometimes, the mad shared cells with the deeply devout, both locked away from the world, both hoping to be saved through suffering. That thin line between madness and piety shows up over and over in medieval life, and nowhere is it more literal than inside these walls. What historians still wrestle with is how aware the people running these dungeons really were. Did they understand the difference between mental illness and sin? Were they cold-hearted jailers, or simply operating within the only system they knew? Some argue that the church and local leaders genuinely believed they were protecting the afflicted from themselves. Others suggest it was more about hiding the uncomfortable truth that the human mind can break in ways that no sermon or sword can fix. You notice a scribbled name etched into one of the walls, crude letters, scratched into stone with something sharper than a fingernail. It reads, "I am still here." That tiny rebellion, that whisper of defiance says more than a dozen scrolls ever could. Someone wanted to be remembered. Someone wanted to be seen. And here's the awful irony. In some cases, these prisoners were visited more regularly than the afflicted living freely in villages. Nobles and clergy would come down to inspect the mad, often more out of curiosity than compassion. There were even whispers of people being shown off as warnings. See what happens if you sin too boldly? Madness wasn't just a condition. It was a cautionary tale. Some dungeons eventually developed their own rules for containment. A few had mad hours, where the shackled were allowed to scream or rave without interference, under the belief that suppressing their madness would only make it worse. Better to let it out like blood from a wound. These rules weren't written down anywhere, of course, but passed quietly between keepers who learned by grim trial and error. You step away from the cells, your ears still ringing with muffled sobs and the metallic creak of restraints. One of the guards offers you a torch and leads you back to the surface. Some of them talk sense, he mutters. Other times, you'd swear they're talking with something else. He doesn't elaborate, doesn't need to. That lingering medieval belief, that madness might be a conversation between man and the other world, still hums under everything. Back above ground, you breathe in the open air like it's your first real breath in hours. The stars are still there. The moon, half gone now, hangs low. And as you look back at the castle's stone silhouette, you realise that for some, madness meant not only losing your mind, but being buried alive with it. The next day, you're back in the village centre where the mood is lighter for once. A juggler tosses apples in the air, a few children run barefoot through puddles, and a man in a brightly coloured outfit struts near the edge of the crowd, grinning as he mimes falling over his own feet. He's the fool, the court jester, though there's no court here. Just people, tired and amused, grateful for a reason to smile. But this fool isn't just performing, he's something more. In medieval society, the fool held a curious role, part entertainer, part social pressure valve, and more interestingly, sometimes a shielded soul, with a mind unlike the rest. You sit by a well and watch as the fool contorts his face into exaggerated expressions, mocking a local knight with just enough charm to avoid offence. He might have a cognitive difference. He might live with a condition we'd now call autism, or a developmental disability. But here, in this medieval village, he's not locked away. He's not labelled as cursed or dangerous. He's included, even celebrated, under a title that's at once affectionate and patronising. In many courts and communities during the Middle Ages, fools were a protected class. Not legally, not officially, but socially. They were allowed to speak out of turn, to poke fun at authority, and sometimes to blurt uncomfortable truths. Why? Because their words could always be brushed off as nonsense. He's just the fool, people would say. He doesn't know better. But sometimes, those words hit a little too close to home, and that's when the fool became the most dangerous man in the room. There's a theory among some scholars that fools served as a kind of social conscience. Because they lived outside the strict rules of etiquette and expectation, they could expose hypocrisy and tension in ways no one else could. If a noble was cruel or a priest was corrupt, the fool could say so, jokingly of course, but the message still landed. The more powerful the fool's observations, the more nervously everyone laughed. But beyond the castles and courts, there were simpler versions of the same role. In small towns and villages, people who behaved differently were sometimes embraced as eccentrics. The man who talked to animals, harmless. The woman who recited poetry to trees. Odd, yes, but not necessarily feared. If their strangeness didn't threaten the social order, it was sometimes absorbed into the fabric of daily life. Everyone had their place, even the ones who didn't fit. That isn't to say everything was rosy. Not everyone found safety in their role. The same behaviour that made you lovable in one village might get you exiled, or worse, in another. Everything hinged on context. Who you were, how well you were known, and what mood the local priest was in. Still, it's worth noting that for some, medieval society offered a kind of accidental protection through performance. If you could make people laugh, or at least puzzle them without scaring them, you might survive just fine. One famous example is the fool of King Henry II, Roland the Farter. Yes, that's real. His job was to perform a well-timed leap, whistle, and fart during Christmas festivities. He was so valued for this that he was reportedly granted land in return for his services. Imagine living with a neurological condition that caused impulsive behaviour or odd motor tics, and finding yourself adored for it, simply because it looked like comedy. It's bizarre, yes, but also kind of brilliant. Here's your fringe fact for the night. Some fools were thought to be divinely inspired. In Eastern Orthodox tradition, especially in Russia, the holy fool or Eurodivi was someone who acted irrationally or bizarrely but was believed to be spiritually gifted. These individuals might run naked through town or shout cryptic messages, and instead of punishment they were venerated. seen as prophets hiding behind madness. Again, we find that slippery line between illness and sanctity, woven deep into cultural attitudes. Of course, modern historians argue about what this really meant. Was this inclusion genuine acceptance, or just a way to contain and manage the unsettling? Was the fool loved, or merely tolerated as a curiosity? It's hard to say. The records are thin, and most of what survives is through art and poetry. Fools shown with bells on their hats and wide, empty smiles. Are they laughing with everyone, or because they don't understand what they've lost? You watch now as the village fool finishes his performance with a cartwheel that ends in a tumble. The crowd claps. Someone tosses him a chunk of bread. He bows low and then, when no one's watching, stares off into the middle distance, his smile fading for just a moment. There's something in his face, not sadness exactly, but a kind of echo. You wonder what he's thinking, or what he sees that no one else does. It's easy to romanticize the figure of the fool, paint them as clever, subversive, secretly wise. But sometimes they were simply people whose minds worked differently. And in a time with no language for neurodiversity, no mental health diagnoses, and no support systems, they found the one role that let them exist outside the norm without punishment. That's not quite freedom, but it's not isolation either. In a way, the fool's story is one of survival through camouflage. If you could make your strangeness useful, or at least entertaining, you could carve out space in a world that otherwise had no place for you. Laugh, and the world might laugh with you. Cry, and they might put you in a cellar. So you keep the bells on, you keep dancing. As the sun dips behind the hills, the juggler and the fool pack up their few belongings and vanish down a winding path. Children mimic their antics as they leave, giggling, free for now. And you're left with the strange realization that in a time when so many were punished for the way their minds worked, laughter was sometimes the only protection. You wake up before dawn, stirred by distant bells and a strange hush that wraps the village in grey mist. This morning your path winds not toward laughter or ritual, but towards something far more unsettling. You're following the story of a woman, Marjorie they call her, who's become both local legend and cautionary tale. She's devout, deeply so, obsessed with prayer, constantly weeping. Sometimes she screams in church, other times she wanders barefoot through town, muttering about Christ's wounds, and people don't know what to do with her. Is she holy or unwell? This right here is the crossroads of faith and madness in the Middle Ages. Marjorie isn't alone. Across medieval Europe, there were countless men and women who experienced extreme religious fervour, sometimes accompanied by behaviours we might now associate with mental illness. Visions, disordered eating, self-punishment, emotional outbursts, auditory hallucinations. These were all seen through a spiritual lens. If you were lucky, and your experiences fit a certain mould, you might be called a mystic. If not, you might be accused of heresy, hysteria, or worse. You find Marjorie kneeling in front of the church, her hands red from hours of clenching rosary beads. Her face is streaked with tears, her eyes wide and glassy. She doesn't seem to see you. Every few minutes she gasps, loud and dramatic, then whispers, "He bleeds again," and presses her palms to her chest. The priest gives her space but watches warily. Everyone's waiting for the moment when her devotion tips from unsettling to unacceptable. This era is filled with people like Marjorie. Some are canonized, others are forgotten or condemned. The boundary between sanctity and sickness is terrifyingly thin. In many cases it comes down to gender, class and timing. If you're a nobleman with visions, you're wise. If you're a poor woman with visions, you're dangerous. Or, depending on who's watching, touched by God. Marjorie, based loosely on a real medieval woman named Marjorie Kemp, is part of a long line of what scholars call holy women. These were female mystics who claimed direct contact with the divine, often bypassing the church hierarchy entirely. That made them both fascinating and threatening. They had no training, no education, yet they spoke of angels, demons, divine messages. Many experienced symptoms we now associate with trauma, anxiety disorders, or even schizophrenia. But instead of therapy, they got confession and scrutiny. One common pattern you start to notice is how closely mental suffering and religious ecstasy intertwine. Marjorie fasts obsessively, eating only herbs and bread crusts for weeks. Her hair falls out. She whips herself during Lent, leaving scars that never fully heal. Some of this is doctrine-driven, imitatio Christi, imitating Christ's suffering. But how much is religious passion, and how much is inner turmoil with nowhere else to go? Another woman, you're told, spent 30 years in silence as penance, locked voluntarily in a small cell built into the church wall. She was an anchorite, a type of religious hermit who died to the world. People would pass food through a slot and ask her for advice, like some kind of spiritual oracle. And maybe she had peace, or maybe she was just terrified of what lived in her own mind when she tried to rejoin the world. And here's a strange but true detail. Some mystics were reported to receive the stigmata, bleeding wounds that mirrored Christ's crucifixion. In rare cases, these wounds appeared spontaneously during ecstatic prayer. Modern historians argue whether these were self-inflicted, psychosomatic, or the result of prolonged stress and malnutrition. Regardless, they added fuel to the belief that suffering was sacred. If you bled while praying, people didn't question your mental health. They built shrines around your bed, but it didn't always go well. Not everyone praised these displays. Church leaders were suspicious. Some accused mystics of faking visions for attention. Others were interrogated for heresy, especially if their messages contradicted church teachings. Joan of Arc, for instance, claimed she heard voices from saints telling her to lead an army. You know how that ended. Fire and ashes. Madness and divinity are not opposites in this world. They're partners in a dangerous dance. What's especially haunting is how often these mystics describe their experiences using the language of pain and confusion. "My soul burns," one wrote. "My mind is a nest of serpents," another said. These aren't peaceful religious experiences, they're raw, agonizing, chaotic, and yet because they're framed as divine, they're sometimes celebrated. There's no therapy, no diagnosis, only prayer and more prayer. The open scholarly debate around all this centres on interpretation. Were these women mentally ill by modern standards? Were they using religion to cope with trauma? Or were they simply engaging in an intense spiritual culture that encouraged extreme expression? The answer might be yes, to all of it. Because medieval society didn't separate the spiritual from the psychological, it was all one tangled mass of soul. You return to Marjorie near sunset. She's now lying face down in the dirt, whispering to the Virgin Mary. Some children giggle and run past her. One tosses a pebble. The priest finally approaches and gently lifts her by the elbow. She goes limp. He mutters a prayer, more for himself than for her. Later, she'll be led to the convent for rest. They won't medicate her, obviously, but they'll feed her, speak softly, let her hold a cross, and maybe, for a little while, the voices will go quiet. Here's your fringe detail for the evening. Some mystics claim to smell divine scents during their visions. Roses, honey, frankincense, regardless of where they were. Others reported that their skin glowed faintly in the dark. Were these hallucinations, delusions, or just medieval poetry layered onto intense psychological events? We'll never know. But their journals, the ones that survived, describe them as vividly real. You walk away from the church with a heavy heart, trying to wrap your mind around a world where madness might be holiness in disguise, or vice versa. In a time with no boundaries between the divine and the diseased, the truly dangerous thing wasn't hearing voices, it was who heard you talking back. You're back in the healer's cottage now, a cramped little hut that smells aggressively of garlic and something earthy you can't quite place. Maybe mugwort, maybe disappointment. The healer is old, wrapped in wool and mystery, her face a topography of fine lines and deep creases like someone carved a map onto her with time. You've come to learn about medieval medicine, specifically how they treated the mind when it wandered off course. And that means we need to talk about blood, and bile, and leeches, so many leeches. She sits you down by the hearth and pours you something thick and bitter from a wooden ladle. You sip it, and immediately regret your choices. It tastes like a swamp having an identity crisis. "Good for the black bile," she says without looking up. You nod politely, pretending to understand, while also trying not to gag. In the Middle Ages, the prevailing theory of medicine came from Galen, a Roman physician whose ideas about the body lingered like smoke for more than 1,000 years. He taught that the human body was governed by 4 humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each humour was linked to a temperament: sanguine, phlegmatic, choleric, melancholic. And when those humours got out of balance, that's when things went sideways. Mental illness, by this logic, was the result of internal imbalance, not spiritual corruption, not sin, not demons, well, not just demons. No, this was a physical problem. Too much black bile? You'd become melancholic, sad, anxious, withdrawn. Too much yellow bile? You'd be irritable, maybe aggressive. Doctors didn't understand neurons or neurotransmitters, but they knew that what was inside your body could mess with your mind. The solution: rebalance the humours, and this is where things get fun, or horrifying, depending on your threshold for historical medicine. To reduce black bile, the healer might prescribe a purge. That could mean vomiting, enemas, or, you guessed it, bloodletting. They'd slice open a vein, usually in the arm, and let the bad humour drain out. Sometimes they used cups and suction. Sometimes leeches. Live, squishy leeches crawling up your leg like little anxiety therapists with no degrees. If your behaviour was particularly erratic, they might bleed you repeatedly over several days. Weakness was considered a sign the treatment was working. You ask the healer about a man who's been howling at night and scratching the walls of his cottage with his bare fingers. She nods knowingly and suggests a tea of valerian root and crushed beetles. You wait to hear if that's a metaphor. It isn't. Then she holds up a dried frog, tied at the legs with twine, and says it should be buried under his threshold to ward off the black mood. You're pretty sure this isn't in any official medical text, but she swears by it. Natural remedies were everywhere. Lavender, chamomile, rosemary, sage, fennel, all used to calm the nerves or clear the head. Some actually helped. Others were placebos wrapped in ritual. Still, there's something beautiful about the care put into these mixtures. They might not have cured mental illness, but they gave people a sense of purpose, a plan. And sometimes that was enough. The more affluent you were, the more elaborate your treatment. Wealthy nobles suffering from melancholy might be sent to the countryside for fresh air and pleasing sights. Doctors recommended music, conversation, gardens, even love as a remedy. One court physician wrote that melancholy may be lightened by the plucking of roses and the sound of a gentle harp. It's a far cry from the dungeon, but again, it depended entirely on who you were. In some monasteries, physicians maintained balance charts, recording a patient's symptoms alongside the weather, diet, and even astrological events. Yes, astrology played a huge role in medieval medicine. Your humours might surge or retreat depending on the position of Mars or the rising of Scorpio. A bad moon and a plate of spoiled mutton, recipe for madness. And here's your strange little footnote for the night. Some healers believed mental illness could be caused by blocked vapours in the brain. Vapours, not spirits, not bile, just raw gas trapped inside the skull, bouncing around like drunk bees. The solution? Bore a hole in the head. Trepanation, the process of drilling into the skull, wasn't common, but it did happen. Sometimes the patient survived, sometimes they didn't. Either way, the healer probably declared it a success. Modern historians still debate whether humorism was entirely useless or just dramatically incomplete. On one hand, bloodletting and forced vomiting were rarely helpful and often dangerous. On the other, the idea that mood and body were connected wasn't wrong. They just didn't have the tools to explore it properly. The whole system was built on observation, not experimentation. You saw what happened, took your best guess, and added sage leaves to it. And of course, not all healers were formally trained. Many were women, midwives, herbalists, people who knew the land better than they knew Latin. They mixed treatments based on experience and intuition. Some of these women were celebrated, others were accused of witchcraft. Again, all about timing. As the healer finishes your cup with an apologetic shrug, she asks you to help hang a bundle of dried herbs above the door. St. John's wort to keep away dark thoughts. It's symbolic, of course, but also not the worst advice. You hang the bundle, say your thanks, and step outside into the cool dusk. You walk away from the cottage with a stomach full of beetle broth, and your head swimming with contradictions. The medieval approach to mental health was flawed, sometimes violently so, but it was also deeply human. People wanted to fix what they couldn't explain. They wanted balance, and sometimes, in the muddled mess of superstition and science, they found it. Evening settles in again, and this time you head not for a healer or a monastery, but towards something more ambiguous, somewhere between miracle and diagnosis, reverence and confusion. You've been told there's a woman in a nearby village who speaks with angels, Not metaphorically, literally. Her name is Agnes, and she's known for going into trances, her body stiff as stone, her mouth whispering in Latin she never learned. People come from miles away to watch her do it, hoping for a message, a sign, or just a glimpse of the divine working through someone far too human. Agnes lives in a tiny room above her father's shop, its single window covered in a lace of soot and candle wax. Inside, it's stuffy and dark, lit by a dozen wax tapers and one flickering oil lamp. She's kneeling when you enter, hands clasped, lips trembling. A small crowd huddles behind you. Townsfolk, a priest, a young knight who looks like he's trying very hard not to be seen. Everyone waits. Then her voice changes. It deepens slightly, the cadence strange and unbroken, like she's reading from an invisible script. She says something about divine fire, about suffering that purifies the soul and then collapses to the floor. Two women rush forward to lay her gently on a sheepskin rug. This is not her first vision, nor will it be her last. In medieval Europe, these kinds of mystical experiences were taken incredibly seriously. When someone had a vision or claimed to hear a divine voice, it wasn't dismissed as nonsense or delusion, not immediately. First, people listened, especially if the person in question was pious, and particularly if they were a woman. Not because women were seen as more holy necessarily, but because their bodies were considered more permeable, more open to spiritual influence for better or worse. You find yourself wondering, what would we call Agnes today? Would we say she's dissociating, experiencing psychosis, speaking in glossolalia, the spontaneous religious language often found in charismatic experiences? Would she be medicated, diagnosed? But here now, in this candle-lit room full of half-held breath, she's a vessel, a sacred speaker, and what she says matters. Agnes's story isn't unique. Medieval records are dotted with people who reported intense mystical episodes. Julian of Norwich, for instance, claimed to see Christ during a life-threatening illness, and spent the rest of her life unpacking that vision in writing. Hildegard of Bingen, a name that sounds like a guitar solo but was in fact a revered abbess, had powerful visions she interpreted as messages from God. These women weren't ignored. They were consulted, admired, even feared. But there was always a catch. The line between revelation and heresy was razor thin. If your visions aligned with church doctrine, you might be canonized. If they didn't, you might be excommunicated, imprisoned, or killed. Many visionaries walked this line daily, learning to couch their experiences in just the right phrasing. I saw an angel was fine. The angel told me the Pope is wrong was a death sentence. And then there were the voices. Many people claimed to hear saints, angels, or even Christ speaking directly to them. Some heard these voices during prayer or fasting. Others heard them constantly, guiding their every move. Today, that's a classic symptom of several psychiatric conditions. But in the medieval world, hearing voices wasn't necessarily a sign of madness. It could be divine communication, or it could be demonic temptation. You weren't mentally ill. You were in a spiritual battle. The question was whose side your invisible companions were on. Sometimes these voices led people to take radical action. A young woman might claim she was told by St. Michael to give away all her possessions. A man might say he had to walk barefoot to Jerusalem because the Virgin instructed him to. These behaviours, when accompanied by public fasting or ecstatic prayer, could either elevate someone to local sainthood or lead to suspicion. Again, it depended entirely on how charismatic you were, how well liked, and whether the local clergy were having a good month. And here's your fringe fact of the night. In some cases, these visionaries inspired actual religious movements. One woman in southern France, Marguerite Porret, wrote a book based on her visions that was deemed heretical. She was burned at the stake, but her ideas lingered, quietly in the margins. Some say her writings influenced later mystical thought, so even when the body was silenced, the visions lived on. You ask the village priest about Agnes. He gives you a tired look and says, "We pray for discernment." That's a polite way of saying, we're not sure if she's a prophet or a liability. He confesses that, when she first began having trances, people flocked to her. But over time, the crowds grew thinner, the visions became darker. Last week she said the village would be consumed by fire. No one knows what to make of it. Scholars today wrestle with this exact question. Were medieval mystics mentally ill, Or were they simply living in a society that gave them a different vocabulary for their experiences? Some say yes, they were ill by modern definitions, but functional within their own cultural context. Others argue that trying to retro-diagnose historical figures is a mistake, that we should take their accounts on their own terms. The debate isn't just academic, it's deeply human. Where does faith end and delusion begin? Back in Agnes's room, she stirs, her eyes open, dazed. Someone hands her water. She drinks mechanically, then mutters, "He is near." Whether that he is Christ, a saint, or something darker, no one asks. They just nod and begin to pray. As you step out into the cool night, the stars overhead seem suddenly too bright, too close. You think about all the people who have heard voices and seen things in the sky, and felt their minds melt into something bigger. Whether it was trauma, illness, faith, or some strange collision of all three, they weren't ignored. They were heard, revered, and sometimes feared. And maybe, just maybe, that recognition mattered more than the truth behind the voice. By now you've probably noticed a pattern. The medieval mind didn't like mystery. It wanted labels, explanations, moral causes, even when none existed. So when someone began acting strangely, seeing visions or showing signs of mental instability, there had to be a reason. If it wasn't the moon or an imbalance of bile, and it wasn't divine inspiration or demonic possession, well, there was still one more convenient option. Witchcraft. You're in a small town now, the kind with crooked lanes and gossip that travels faster than the wind. You hear whispers before you even reach the market square. "She spoke to a fox," one woman hisses, "and now her neighbour's milk has gone sour." Another murmurs, "She doesn't sleep. She sings to the wind. That's not natural." The centre of all this fearful muttering? A woman named Elsbeth, widowed, middle-aged, with a hunched back, and a stare that makes children look away. She lives in a crooked little hut at the edge of the woods, and most damning of all, she talks to herself. You see where this is going. Elsbeth, according to the villagers, is a witch. But if you spend even a few minutes near her, you'll notice something else. She's talking aloud, yes, but not casting spells. She's repeating the same phrases over and over, her fingers twitching in rhythm. Her garden is immaculate. She walks in circles at dusk, muttering numbers under her breath. Today, we might call this obsessive-compulsive behaviour. In the Middle Ages, it's suspicious at best, damning at worst. When mental illness and unexplainable behaviour appeared in women, especially women on the margins of society, the leap from confusion to condemnation was quick and brutal. The witch trials weren't just about theology, they were about fear, and those who couldn't conform, who didn't behave, who made others uncomfortable without being able to explain why, they often found themselves at the centre of that fear. The idea of the mentally ill being mistaken for witches isn't speculation. It happened. Court records from various witch trials include testimonies describing women who claimed to hear voices, who saw spirits, who engaged in bizarre, repetitive behaviours. These weren't just evil people. These were people suffering, and rather than offering care or understanding, society offered fire. The witch hunts ramped up in the late medieval period, especially from the 15th century onward. That's when manuals like the Malleus Maleficarum, basically the witch hunter's guide to everything, started circulating. It encouraged authorities to look for specific signs of witchcraft, and unfortunately, many of those signs overlap with symptoms of mental disorders. Unusual sleep patterns, moods that change rapidly, social withdrawal, inappropriate laughter, auditory hallucinations, all could be interpreted as evidence of diabolical influence. And here's your quirky, horrible fact for the evening. Some accused witches were tested using the water ordeal. They'd be bound and thrown into a body of water. If they floated, it meant they'd rejected baptism and were in league with the devil. If they sank, innocent, but possibly dead. It's the kind of logic that makes you want to invent time travel just so you can go back and slap someone. Even more disturbing is how gendered all of this was. About 75 to 85% of accused witches were women, and the ones most likely to be targeted: the poor, the elderly, the widowed, the eccentric. In other words, women like Elsbeth, vulnerable, isolated, and just odd enough to make people nervous. A man might rant in public and be labelled a prophet or a madman. A woman? Witch, evil, dangerous. You visit Elsbeth's home under the pretense of buying herbs. Inside, it's surprisingly warm and orderly. Dried lavender hangs from the beams. A small fire crackles in the hearth. She offers you nettle tea and calls you sweetheart in a voice both tired and kind. But she doesn't stop muttering even as she moves about. Her eyes dart from corner to corner as if tracking something only she can see. She shows you her herb jars, some labelled, some not, and points to the ones she claims cure headaches, soothe childbirth, ward off nightmares. Maybe they work, maybe they don't, but it's clear she believes in what she does. That conviction, that gentle madness, has made her dangerous in the eyes of the village, not because she's done harm, but because she doesn't fit the mould. It's not just the peasantry who feared people like Elsbeth. Educated men, judges, clerics, physicians, often endorsed these trials. They brought authority to the madness, citing books and scriptures as they signed execution orders. Some genuinely believed they were rooting out evil. Others used the panic for power. Either way, mentally ill individuals caught in the crosshairs didn't stand a chance. There's debate among scholars about how many accused witches were actually mentally ill. Some argue it was a small percentage. Others believe the overlap is far greater than records suggest. After all, mental illness wasn't recognised, so no one was writing, "This woman exhibits signs of severe depression." They wrote, "She weeps constantly and brings bad luck. Same behaviour, different lens. You finish your tea and thank Elsbeth." She gives you a little bag of dried mint for clarity. As you step outside, you hear someone across the field shout, "Witch!" It's half a joke, half a warning. She doesn't respond, just keeps whispering to herself, brushing non-existent dust from her apron. As the sun dips behind the hills, casting long, warped shadows, you think about how fragile the line between survival and scapegoating really was. One poorly timed hallucination, one misunderstood behaviour, one moment of honesty about what you saw or feared, and you could go from villager to villain. In this world, to be visibly mentally ill is to be unprotected, vulnerable, and if you're a woman, doubly so. Your mind can betray you. But worse than that, everyone else might decide it's your fault. Morning returns with a chill of damp mist and a strange tension hanging in the air. You're back in a nearby village square, this one more cautious, more controlled. Something feels off, like everyone's waiting for a curtain to lift on a play no one really wants to watch. Today the gossip isn't about witches or visions. It's about a young woman named Isolde who hasn't spoken in days, hasn't left her bed, and, most distressingly to the townspeople, hasn't cried since her baby died. They say her womb has turned on her. This, unfortunately, was a very real belief. In medieval Europe, a woman's mental health was often linked directly, sometimes absurdly, to her reproductive system. The dominant medical idea, borrowed from ancient Greece and never quite questioned, was something called uterine suffocation, or the wandering womb. The theory went like this: if a woman's womb wasn't occupied by a baby, by regular cycles, by frequent sex, it would become bored, or restless, or lonely, depending on who you asked, and begin to move around the body. Yes, move. Like a tiny, grumpy animal inside her, crawling up toward her lungs or brain and wreaking havoc. So when Isolde stopped eating and began staring blankly at the wall, when her muscles tensed randomly and she flinched at light, the whispers began. Her womb is lost, they say. It's tangled in her chest. No one mentions grief. No one talks about trauma. They talk about steam and imbalance and the need to coax the womb back down into place. The local midwife comes to examine her. She's not unkind, just wrapped up in centuries of wrong ideas. She lights rosemary and rue, places warmed cloths on Isolde's abdomen, and instructs the women around her to sing softly. These are treatments designed to entice the womb back to its rightful place. Other methods included holding pungent herbs under the nose, hoping the womb would retreat from the chest in disgust, or applying oils to the thighs to trap it. It sounds ridiculous now, but for centuries this theory dominated medical approaches to women's mental and physical health. Anxiety, the womb, hysteria, definitely the womb. Depression, again, blame the uterus. Women were seen as biologically unstable, emotional, fluid, governed by their bodily cycles. The word hysteria itself comes from hystera, the Greek word for uterus. If a woman laughed too much, cried too little, raged in public, or just didn't conform. Hysteria. Case closed. The treatment options were as varied as they were disturbing. Some were harmless, warm baths, massage, scented herbs. Others veered into outright assault. Forced intercourse was sometimes prescribed, under the belief that a lack of sexual activity caused the condition. Marry her off, the logic went. Let the husband fix it. It's a gross distortion of medicine, but a revealing one. In a world where women's autonomy was already shaky, their bodies became battlegrounds and their minds were often collateral damage. And this extended to childbirth too. Postpartum depression wasn't understood. Instead, if a new mother became distant, agitated or overwhelmed, it was taken as a sign that her womb had been damaged in labour or had failed to return to its natural state. There was no counselling, no support groups, just midwives, priests and panic. Isolde, for what it's worth, doesn't respond to the herbs or singing. She lies motionless, her hands pressed to her belly as if she's holding something still inside her. A priest is summoned. He sprinkles holy water over her head and mumbles prayers about sorrow and salvation. One of the women whispers that it might be demonic influence after all. Another says the baby's spirit is angry. No one says trauma. That word won't come for centuries. Here's a bizarre fringe detail. In some parts of medieval Europe, it was believed that the womb had teeth, that it could bite internal organs. This was symbolic more than anatomical, but still, the image of a body devouring itself from the inside was a popular way to explain what couldn't be seen. Madness in women became monstrous, and once you were labelled hysterical, it was nearly impossible to be taken seriously again. There's a lot of debate today about how much of this belief system was ignorance versus control. Was the wandering womb a genuine misunderstanding of anatomy? Or was it a convenient way to police women's behaviour, medicalising defiance, pathologising grief, making disobedience into a disorder? Probably both. The two were often tangled together like ivy and stone. Women who didn't conform, especially those who remained unmarried, childless or outspoken, were more likely to be branded hysterical or unstable. And once you earned that reputation, even the smallest eccentricity could confirm it. Laughing alone, dangerous. Reading too much, suspicious. Speaking about dreams, better call a priest. Silence, strangely, was safer. Back in Isolde's home, the air grows heavy. She hasn't moved, and now the midwife looks uneasy. Maybe she's gone deeper than the womb, she mutters. The priest frowns. A decision is made. She'll be taken to the convent for rest. This is sometimes the medieval version of an institution. Quiet, controlled, away from watchful eyes. Maybe she'll recover there. Or maybe she'll be forgotten behind stone walls and whispered about only when the milk turns sour again. As they lift her onto a cart, she doesn't resist. Just blinks slowly, lips parted, as if trying to speak, but forgetting how. You walk alongside the procession, wondering how many women were treated like this, how many minds were lost not to madness, but to misunderstanding. Because in this world, female suffering is never just emotional. It's spiritual, it's sexual, it's anatomical. And almost always, it's blamed on a womb no one can see, chasing explanations no one dares question. The cart rolls out of view, and the hush that follows feels colder than the wind. You stay standing on the edge of the village road, watching dust settle, watching people return to their lives like nothing happened. But it lingers. Isolde's silence, the murmurs, the way no one could name her suffering but still felt sure she needed to be taken away. You turn from the road and head toward the hills, following a different story. One not about confinement, but about movement. Tonight you're going on pilgrimage. In the medieval world, when the soul felt heavy and the mind restless, one cure offered to the devout and the desperate alike was to walk, literally toward God. Pilgrimage wasn't just a spiritual journey. For some, it was a last resort for mental peace. You packed a bundle, tied on your best shoes, which probably weren't great, and walked hundreds of miles toward a holy site, hoping, pleading, bargaining. Maybe your sorrow would loosen. Maybe the weight would lift. You're walking with a man named Thomas. His eyes dart, his fingers twitch, and he speaks in loops. Over and over he mutters about his sins, about a burning sensation in his chest that no healer could fix. I must go to Santiago, he says. I must kneel there, and it will stop. No one in his town tried to stop him. In fact, they gave him food and pointed him toward the road. It's better this way, they said. He might be healed, or at least someone else will deal with him. Pilgrimages were deeply embedded in medieval life. There were famous routes: Canterbury, Santiago de Compostela, Rome, Jerusalem, stamped into the landscape like arteries of faith. But smaller shrines were everywhere. Local saints, relics, holy wells, miracle trees. People walked to them not just for salvation, but for relief. Relief from disease, drought, heartbreak, and yes, from madness. Tomas tells you he's been walking for 6 days. His feet are blistered, his tunic stained with road dust. But when he talks about the shrine, his whole face changes. It's the first time you see something other than fear. There's hope there, desperate and flickering, but real. And that's what pilgrimages offered the mentally ill. Hope when no other path made sense. If the doctors bled you and the priests prayed at you and the townsfolk avoided your eyes, maybe a long walk would help. The logic wasn't just spiritual. There was a practical, if unspoken, benefit. Moving troubled individuals away from the community. Pilgrimage served a dual purpose. It offered the sufferer purpose and distraction, and it offered the village distance. Out of sight, out of scandal. Some pilgrimages were voluntary, others less so. There are records of towns encouraging a troubled soul to leave on pilgrimage and simply not come back. But not everyone treated it as exile. For many, pilgrimage was meaningful, sacred, and yes, sometimes healing. Walking gave rhythm, it gave structure. You focused on your feet, your breath, the road. You passed strangers who didn't know your story. You slept in barns or on monastery floors. You saw the sky change colour and forgot your own name for a while. For a fractured mind, that kind of quiet monotony could be a balm. Of course, not everyone made it. Pilgrimages were gruelling. Bandits, disease, starvation, accidents. It wasn't a safe venture. And if your mental state was fragile to begin with, the road could unravel you further. Some disappeared, some were found raving beside holy springs. Others were taken in by monasteries along the route, where they were fed and gently, if ineffectively, kept from harming themselves. You stop with Thomas at a roadside shrine. A rough wooden cross stands beside a trickling stream. He kneels, pulls a coin from a pouch and places it at the base. Then he begins whispering. Not in prayer exactly, but in a strange apologetic rhythm. I didn't mean it. I didn't mean it. I didn't mean it. You don't ask what he means. He doesn't look ready to know either. Some shrines were known for specific cures. One might be famous for healing fevers, another for restoring sight, another for cleansing the mind. These reputations were often passed through generations. Go there, they'd say. The water is holy. Sometimes there were legends. An angel appeared here, or a saint's tears fell there, or someone drank from the spring and stopped screaming for the first time in months. And here's your strange fact for the night. Some pilgrims suffering mental afflictions were advised to carry symbolic weights, stones, chains, even wooden crosses. The idea was to make the burden literal, to transform emotional torment into something the body could carry, and sometimes, when they finally laid those burdens down at a shrine, something shifted. Maybe it was spiritual, maybe it was psychological, but the release was real. There's some debate among scholars about how effective pilgrimage was as a form of mental healing. Did people come back cured? Some did. Others returned exactly the same, or worse. But there are surviving accounts of people experiencing calm, joy, even revelation along the journey. And whether or not a miracle occurred, the structure of the ritual itself offered comfort. The goal wasn't always transformation. Sometimes it was endurance. To keep walking, to keep hoping. You and Thomas share a loaf of bread beside the stream. He hums under his breath. Not quite a tune, more like a memory. When he speaks again, it's quieter. I think, when I get there, I won't need to scream anymore. You nod. You don't tell him that healing doesn't always work that way. You don't mention that the shrine at Santiago is crowded, chaotic, commercialized in a way that might overwhelm him. You just let him hold on to his vision. Because in this world, with its leeches and relics and misunderstandings, pilgrimage offers something precious. Agency. Thomas chose this. Chose to walk, to hope, to lay his broken mind at the feet of something bigger than himself. As dusk settles over the road, you help him up, and the two of you begin walking again, feet shuffling through dust and prayer. Somewhere ahead, the shrine waits. Whether it cures or not is almost beside the point. You arrive in a different kind of stillness now, a quiet house where no one has spoken above a whisper in days. The shutters are drawn. A single candle burns near the door, its wax pooling like melted bone. Inside, a young man lies curled in bed, his eyes open, unblinking, staring through the wall like he's trying to see a different world. His mother sits beside him, clutching a rosary so tightly it's left little round impressions in her palm. "He hasn't slept," she whispers. "He says he can't. Says the dreams are too loud." Tonight we're stepping into the medieval mind's take on dreams, and what they meant when the line between sleeping and waking began to blur. In a time before psychology, before neurology, before sleep studies and REM cycles, dreams weren't background noise. They were messages, warnings, proof that other realms existed just behind your eyelids. And for people struggling with mental illness, dreams could be a terrifying battleground, one that wasn't just private but public with consequences. The young man in the bed, his name is Alwyn, hasn't slept through the night in over a week. He jerks awake with a scream, drenched in sweat, crying about a wolf with no face and children singing under the floorboards. His family doesn't know what to make of it, so they've brought in a dream interpreter. Yes, that was a real profession. Sometimes the village priest, sometimes a local wise woman, sometimes a monk with just enough Latin and imagination to spin a nightmare into scripture. Dreams were rarely just dreams. They could be signs of divine favour or divine wrath. If you dreamed of angels, the town might declare you blessed. If you dreamed of fire, demons, or endless falling, better hope you have an alibi. In some cases, people were accused of consorting with the devil, based solely on what they described from their dreams. A woman who dreamed of flying could be said to have visited the Sabbath of witches. A man who dreamed of drowning might be warned that his soul was sinking too. Everything was symbolic, and everything was up for interpretation. And in Alwyn's case, it's not just one dream, it's a cycle. Over and over, the same imagery. The wolf, the singing children, the dark water that climbs the walls. His father tried to beat it out of him 2 nights ago. That only made things worse. Now Alwyn won't eat. He flinches when someone enters the room. "They're waiting," he whispers, eyes darting. "They come when I blink." You sit with the interpreter, an old monk from the nearby priory who has arrived carrying a battered book full of saints and symbols. He listens carefully to the boy's account, then declares that the wolf is a sign of judgment, the children are his forgotten sins, and the water is the Holy Spirit trying to cleanse him. That last part sounds a little like comfort. The rest, not so much. This method of interpreting dreams, matching images to theological meanings, was common in medieval Europe. Monks wrote whole manuals for decoding nocturnal visions. The wolf might mean betrayal. A ladder could mean divine ascension. A serpent. Temptation, obviously. They weren't just guessing. These symbols had centuries of tradition behind them, but for people like Alwyn, the effect could be terrifying. A dream wasn't just a dream, it was proof of the state of your soul, and when your dreams were filled with terror, that said something about you. There's an especially strange theory from this period that if you dreamed too vividly or too often, it meant your imagination had escaped your reason. That phrase, escaped your reason, is how they explained everything from hallucinations to psychosis to obsession. The mind had unlatched from logic, like a gate swinging open in a storm, and now anything could crawl through. Dreams, then, weren't just symptoms. They were invaders. Here's your fringe fact of the night. Some people believed dreams were literal journeys, that your soul actually left your body and wandered. If you died in a dream, you might not wake up. If you saw someone who had passed, it meant they were calling you over. There are stories of people being buried after dying in their sleep. No physical injury, no illness, just taken by the dream. It's eerie, poetic, and impossible to prove, but in the medieval mind it made perfect sense. Of course, sleep disorders were completely misunderstood. Night terrors, demon visitations, sleep paralysis, a witch riding your chest. There's even artwork from the period showing small goblins squatting on sleepers' bodies, holding their eyes open, whispering into their ears. That's how it felt, they said. Like something was on you, something unseen, something cruel. And let's not forget prophetic dreams. Those were the most prized and the most dangerous. If you claimed your dream predicted the death of a noble or the fall of a town, you'd better be right. Or quiet. There are records of people being imprisoned, even executed for dream heresy. Other times, those same dreams earned people protection. Again, it all came down to who you were and whether your dreams flattered or frightened the right people. Alwyn stirs. For a moment his eyes clear. He asks for water. His mother, almost giddy, hurries to get it. The monk leans in and murmurs a blessing. "You're being shown something important," he says. "You must listen to it." It's well-meaning, maybe even helpful, but it also reinforces the idea that Alwyn's mind is no longer his own, that even his suffering belongs to some larger plan. Modern scholars have argued over how to read medieval dream interpretation. Some see it as early psychology, an attempt to understand the subconscious, even without that word. Others call it organised superstition. But maybe, like so much else in this era, it was both. Dreams were the only safe place to voice fear, desire, guilt, and by listening to them, however imperfectly, people were trying, in their own strange way, to understand each other. As night falls, you leave Alwyn's house quietly, your footsteps muffled on damp stone. He's still whispering, still dreaming while awake, still trapped between worlds, and you think about how, in a time before therapy, people tried to decode their minds with prayer and metaphor, with saints and symbols and fear. They couldn't stop the dreams, but they tried to read them like maps, and sometimes maybe that was enough to survive the night. You leave behind the candlelit room and Alwyn's haunted eyes, following a path out toward the edge of the forest. The sky's pale now, all fog and aching light, and the air smells faintly of wood smoke and moss. You're not looking for shrines or relics tonight. You're heading into the wilds, into the herbs, the folklore, and the strange little remedies that medieval minds used when they had no idea what was really going on upstairs. And among those curling vines and boiling pots of root water, you'll find a mix of genuine healing and absolute chaos. There's a hut nestled under the trees, roof sagging under moss and age, chimney puffing out lavender-scented smoke. Inside lives Bruna, the herbalist. She's not officially trained. There were no degrees in the 1300s for mental health and herbology, but she knows what plants grow where and what they seem to do when crushed, steeped or smoked. You step inside, and she greets you with a grunt and a handful of dried blue flowers. "For the sadness," she says, stuffing them into a linen pouch. You ask what they are. She shrugs. "Helps some, makes others talk to rabbits." And just like that, you're knee-deep in the medieval world of folk medicine and surreal mental health treatments. Bruna's shelves are full of tiny wonders and big mistakes. Dried rose hips, crushed valerian root, St. John's wort, still used today actually to treat mild depression. She's got sprigs of meadowsweet for headaches, poppy seeds to numb grief, and bundles of sage that she burns to clear the air of heavy thoughts. Some of these herbs have mild calming effects, others questionable. A few are downright toxic. But people keep coming because the monks don't always understand, and the doctors just want to bleed you. Bruna at least will listen, and boil something for you while she does. When someone in town begins to show signs of what we'd now call anxiety or depression, the first stop might be a healer like this. Not a dungeon, not a church, just a woman with a pot of fennel tea and a very curious attitude toward mushrooms. She mixes not just medicine, but metaphor. She'll tell you your sorrow is like a root that's curled around your stomach, or that your dreams have been poisoned by bad air from the swamp. She'll suggest sleeping with your feet pointed north, or burying your weeping under a rosemary bush. It's nonsense, and it's oddly comforting. You meet a man in her hut who claims he hasn't slept in 3 weeks, not because of demons, but because of grief. Bruna gives him a paste made from lettuce seeds and honey, and smears it on his chest. The heart needs to soften, she says. He doesn't question it. He's tried everything else. Here's where it gets strange, and strangely poetic. Medieval folk healers believed in sympathetic magic, the idea that like affects like. So if your mind feels scattered, you might be given a plant with delicate starbus-shaped leaves, something that looks scattered itself. If your soul feels heavy, you might carry a stone that floats in water. Logic, number, but metaphorical resonance, absolutely. And sometimes the rituals around the remedies mattered more than the ingredients. Bruna instructs people to drink her tea under the full moon, or in silence, or while walking backwards through their own doorway. It's performance, yes, but it gives structure, and structure in the midst of mental chaos, can be oddly stabilizing. The placebo effect isn't just modern, it's ancient, and it works through belief. Of course, not all remedies were gentle, some were terrifying. You learn that in nearby villages, people were fed concoctions of boiled animal brains, deer urine, or charred hedgehog to shock the madness out. One popular belief was that you could burn the clothes of the afflicted and make them inhale the smoke, somehow driving out the troubled spirit. If that didn't work, there were herbs that induced vomiting, convulsions, or wild hallucinations. The thinking, maybe if you could break the fever, or the person, they'd come back different. Bruna winces when you ask her about those cures. That's not healing, she says. That's desperation. But it wasn't just herbs and minerals. Music was also prescribed. Certain songs, played on a lute or a reed flute, were said to realign the humours. One particularly cheerful melody was believed to lift melancholy if played near the patient every morning. Bruna has an old cracked lyre she pulls down from the wall and strums gently while boiling elderflower. It sounds like someone arguing with a cat, but it makes her smile. Sometimes that's enough. Now for your fringe fact of the night. Some healers swore by the power of animal companions. If you were plagued by mad thoughts, it was said that keeping a calm animal nearby, especially a rabbit, lamb, or even a goose, could absorb the illness. Some people believed animals had souls soft enough to take on your burden. Others believed the animal would carry your madness away if set free at the right moment, often during twilight or a storm. There are actual records of people releasing pigs with little herbs tied around their necks. No one knows what the pigs thought about this. This approach, combining herbalism, ritual, and emotional care, wasn't scientific, but it was deeply human. Healers like Bruna didn't cure everyone, but they treated people as if their pain mattered. They didn't call it mental illness, they didn't have the language for that. But they recognized suffering, and they tried to ease it. That matters. And yes, modern historians debate just how effective any of this was. Some call folk medicine a primitive but sincere attempt at care. Others focus on the danger, how many people were poisoned or denied real help because of superstition. But it's hard to ignore the deeper truth. When people had nowhere else to turn, this was where they went. To the women in huts with herb bundles and cracked fingernails. To the ones who understood that healing wasn't always about curing, it was about comforting. As you leave Bruna's cottage, she tucks a sachet into your pocket. Night mint, she says. Good for dreams. You walk away under a canopy of trees, listening to the wind tickle the leaves like whispers. And you realise sometimes the most powerful medicine is simply being listened to, without fear, without judgment, with a little mint and a whole lot of mystery. You've wandered far now, beyond the villages and forests, into a town where something altogether stranger is happening. It's not a festival, not a mass, and not another exorcism, though it has the same air of nervous ceremony. People are gathered in the town square, not just humans, but animals. Yes, actual animals. A pig sits on a wooden stool looking bored. A rooster paces in a pen. There's a goat wearing what looks suspiciously like a tiny hat. You think you've walked into a dream. But no, this is real. This is a trial. And the defendants? Livestock. Welcome to one of the more bizarre corners of the medieval mind, the animal trial. And believe it or not, mental illness has a strange role to play in this legal theatre. In medieval Europe, it wasn't uncommon for animals to be put on trial for crimes. If a pig attacked a child, it might be arrested, given a lawyer, and sentenced, sometimes to death. If a cow wandered into a church and knocked over a candle, well, she might be accused of sacrilege. You're thinking, surely this is symbolic. Not always. These were full legal proceedings, with judges, witnesses, and punishments. You're witnessing one now, and no one's laughing. The pig on trial today allegedly bit a baker's son, who later died of infection. Whether it was provoked or rabid is beside the point. The crowd is here to see justice done. The town's priest has blessed the courtroom. The clerk is sharpening a feather quill. You take a seat near the back and wonder how this has anything to do with mental health. But then you start to listen. The prosecutor accuses the pig of malice, says it attacked with intent, that it acted as no beast of God should. The argument isn't just about action, it's about motive, and this is where things get strange. Because to believe an animal could harbour malice is to believe it has a soul, or a conscience, or in this case, a corrupted spirit. The town has projected its own discomfort, fear, and confusion onto this pig. It doesn't make sense to say a child died because of accident or misfortune or poor sanitation. It makes more sense, more manageable, to say the pig was evil. And this is where the overlap with mental illness becomes chillingly clear. In a society that couldn't explain erratic human behaviour, sometimes it made more sense to offload that confusion onto animals. Blaming animals for violence, for misfortune, even for madness itself, gave people a scapegoat that felt controllable. If a man went mad and howled in the streets, some would say he'd been bewitched by a toad. If a woman began hallucinating, they might look to her cat. Pets, especially cats, frogs and black birds, were often considered familiars, demonic sidekicks who brought madness and chaos to their human companions. So yes, animals were put on trial, but they were also blamed for the mental illnesses of their owners. A man might be chained to a wall, and the town would whisper that his goat had looked at him sideways 3 days before the madness began. A woman who wept too often might be accused of nursing a mouse spirit under her bed. The animal trial, then, wasn't just about crime, it was about symbolic transfer. Your madness couldn't be explained, but someone, or something, could still be punished for it. You look around the courtroom and see just how seriously everyone is taking this. No one finds it absurd that a goat is waiting outside accused of disturbing the peace by escaping its pen during a funeral. People need the ritual, the formality. They need to do something. Mental illness back then didn't end in understanding. It ended in action, exorcism, isolation, pilgrimage, or in cases like this, punishment of something adjacent. There's a fringe story you hear from an old woman sitting beside you. She says that years ago a donkey was put on trial for braying during a mass. The donkey's owner, a boy with frequent seizures, was blamed for teaching it devilish behaviour. The donkey was acquitted, but the boy was sent to a monastery. He never came back. This story isn't unique. Many animal trials had human consequences, especially for those already seen as odd or unstable. One particularly haunting account comes from 1386 in Falaise, France, where a pig was not only tried for killing a child, but dressed in human clothing before execution, like a sick parody of justice. Some historians say this was done to emphasise the animal's guilt. Others think it was a way of symbolically cleansing the village of its grief and confusion. Either way, the message was clear. When people didn't understand violence, they invented logic to contain it, even if it wore wool trousers and had hooves. You sit through the end of the trial. The pig is found guilty. The sentence, public execution. The crowd disperses in an odd blend of satisfaction and discomfort. A few children throw stones. The priest recites a prayer. And the baker who lost his son says nothing at all. On the surface, this was a legal farce, but underneath it was something else. A village trying to process grief. A community needing an explanation that didn't involve disease, unpredictability, or the randomness of tragedy. And when those explanations weren't available, they picked a target. Animal, woman, madman. It didn't really matter. Scholars today debate the true nature of these trials. Were they symbolic? Entertainment? A social pressure valve? Maybe all of the above. But many agree on this. They show us how deeply medieval people feared the unknown, and how far they'd go to feel like they had control over it. As the square empties, you watch a boy tie a chicken to a post and whisper into its ear. He's shaking slightly, muttering something about dreams and snakes. His mother shoos him away. "Don't talk like that," she snaps. "You want people to think the bird cursed you?" And just like that, you see the cycle. Fear passed down, blame passed sideways, confusion tied to a chicken, then buried with a ritual and silence. The real trial, you think, wasn't about pigs or goats. It was about everything people couldn't bear to see in themselves. Their fear, their sorrow, their madness. Better to tie it to something else, something that could be killed without consequence. Because in this world, explanation is a comfort. And when truth fails, a scapegoat, four-legged or not, will do. You leave the courthouse behind as dusk bleeds into night, and the road ahead shimmers with a different kind of unease. Not from silence, but from sound. Drums, flutes, bare feet slapping against cobblestones, laughter that doesn't quite sound joyful. You follow the noise until the town opens up into a square that is anything but ordinary. Dozens of people are dancing, but not like it's a celebration, not like they're choosing to. This is frenzied, feverish movement, arms flailing, necks jerking, faces twisted with something closer to pain than bliss. Some fall, get up, and keep going. Others twitch and convulse in time with invisible music. Welcome to the medieval dancing plague. No, really, this happened. In July of 1518 in the city of Strasbourg, a woman named Frau Trophea began to dance in the street. For no reason, no music, no celebration. She danced for hours, then days, then others joined her. First a dozen, then 100. Within a week, the square was filled with bodies jerking uncontrollably, unable to stop, sweating, bleeding, some even collapsing and dying from sheer exhaustion. No one knew why, and this wasn't an isolated incident. Dancing manias, as they're now called, cropped up in towns across Europe over several centuries. You stop at the edge of the square and watch, unsettled. There's rhythm but no joy, motion but no music. It feels like a nightmare. And yet the townsfolk don't flee. They stand and gawk, some cross themselves, others whisper about spirits, or poison, or sin. The local bishop, you're told, believes it's divine punishment. These people must be releasing demons through their feet. The prescription? Let them dance it out. So they bring in musicians, real ones, to play along, to encourage it. Let that sink in. Medieval doctors and priests watched people dance themselves into collapse and thought, yes, more flutes. But there's something darker going on here. Something that sits right at the intersection of psychology, social pressure and desperation. Today, some historians and psychologists believe these dancing plagues were episodes of mass psychogenic illness. Think mass hysteria, but on a physical level. One person panics, then another, and another, until the collective stress breaks through the body like a flood. In a society that didn't have language for trauma, anxiety or depression, this is how it emerged. Through the body, through movement no one could stop. The conditions were ripe for it. Famine, disease, oppression, constant fear of war, demons or divine wrath. It wasn't just individuals losing their grip. It was whole communities cracking under the weight of everything they couldn't control, and because they believed the body and soul were tightly linked. Physical symptoms made perfect sense. Dance too long. It must be a spirit. Twitch involuntarily. Possession. Fall into a trance. Divine message. Or divine punishment. And here's the fringe detail that will haunt you later. In some versions of the dancing mania, witnesses reported seeing the dancers cry while they moved. Weep uncontrollably. Some begged for help as their feet kept going. That's not joy. That's not a party. That's a breakdown disguised as ritual. And no one could stop it. You walk through the crowd and talk to an old woman holding a bowl of vinegar. She says her daughter's been dancing for 3 days. She keeps feeding her broth, wiping her feet, praying to St. Vitus. That's the saint people turn to in cases like this. Vitus was believed to protect against neurological disorders, twitches, seizures, convulsions. His name even got tied to the phenomenon, St. Vitus's dance. They'd hang ribbons on his statue and hope it would stop the madness. Some even blamed the River Rhine, said the water was cursed or infected with some strange force. Others whispered about contaminated bread, that the rye had been tainted with ergot, a hallucinogenic fungus that mimics LSD. It's possible, it's plausible, but it doesn't explain why only some were affected, or why the dance followed a strange logic, spreading like wildfire in some towns and skipping others entirely. You pause to watch a boy no older than 12 stumble and drop to his knees. His eyes are glazed, hands twitching. His mother rushes in, scoops him up, and whispers into his ear, rocking him back and forth while his legs continue to spasm. She doesn't cry, she just rocks, like she's done it before. Modern scholars have tried to pin it all down. Mass psychogenic illness, ergotism, epilepsy. Some even suggest these were ancient trauma responses. Think about it. In a society with no therapy, no mental health care, no safe language for emotional distress, people had to express suffering in other ways. Through the body, through collapse, through compulsive movement. If you couldn't speak the language of pain, you danced it instead. Until you bled. There's a chilling moment near the end of the night. A man drenched in sweat stops dancing. Just stops. Everyone around him keeps moving, but he stands still, looking down at his own feet like they've betrayed him. Then slowly he begins to cry. Not loud, not performative, just quiet weeping that shakes his shoulders. A few minutes later he collapses and doesn't get back up. No one rushes to him. A priest leans over and murmurs a prayer, a woman places a coin on his chest, the crowd keeps dancing, and you start to realise something terrible. Sometimes madness is catching, not through spirits or curses, but through shared desperation. Through exhaustion so heavy it spills out of you whether you want it to or not. These weren't weak people. They were people with nowhere else for their suffering to go. The medieval mind had no clean way to explain this, so it leaned on what it knew: sin, saints, demons, and balance. But deep down, you feel the truth. They were dancing because everything else had failed. As the fire in the centre of the square crackles and another wave of drumming starts up, you step back into the shadows, out of reach of the rhythm. You wrap your cloak tighter and head down a quieter path. Somewhere behind you, feet still slap the ground like drums of desperation. And ahead? Well, ahead lies whatever the morning hasn't burned down yet. The dancing fades behind you like a fever dream, and soon you're walking through woods so quiet they seem to hold their breath. There's no crowd here, no drums, no twisted rituals or muttered prayers. Just wind through branches, bird song, and the sound of your own footsteps crunching along a mossy path. You've come here because, in a world that rarely understood the mind, some people made the boldest choice possible. They left it all behind. Tonight you're seeking out the hermits, the solitary men and women who walked away from society, from noise, from judgment, and chose a life of contemplation, silence, and solitude. You might think it's unrelated to mental health, but you'd be wrong, because for many this retreat into the wilderness wasn't just spiritual, it was therapeutic, a kind of medieval self-prescribed exile, an escape that doubled as healing. You finally see him near a stream, a man wrapped in wool and skins, face half hidden by a scraggly beard, sitting on a flat rock with his hands folded in his lap. He doesn't look up, doesn't seem startled by your presence. He just breathes slowly like he's part of the forest now. His name is Brother Leontius, though there's no one here to call him that. He hasn't spoken in years, by choice, and if you ask the villagers miles away, they'll tell you he used to be mad. He heard voices. He wandered into the river once and had to be pulled out. They say he was cursed, or gifted, depending on who you ask. Either way, one day he walked into the woods and didn't come back, and yet here he is, alive, calm, solitary but not broken. Hermits were a strange and contradictory fixture of the medieval world. Some were deeply respected. People made pilgrimages just to see them, to receive a silent blessing, to touch their robes. Others were feared, ridiculed, even avoided. They lived in caves, built tiny huts, or slept in hollowed-out tree stumps. They ate whatever they could forage, relied on handouts, and spent most of their time in prayer, meditation, or silence. Some were deeply religious, modelling themselves after the desert fathers of early Christianity, monks who believed proximity to God required distance from man. But others were escaping something: grief, guilt, or simply the relentless scrutiny of a world that didn't know what to do with their minds. You sit across from Leontius and study him. His fingers move slightly, tracing invisible patterns on his knee. His eyes flick toward the sky, watching the clouds like they're trying to teach him something. He doesn't seem distressed, just removed, at peace maybe, or maybe just finally alone in a way that doesn't feel threatening. It's easy to romanticize hermits now, like they were early minimalists or peaceful monks, but the truth was more complicated. Some hermits likely suffered from what we'd now call schizophrenia or severe anxiety. Others may have experienced depressive episodes so intense that removing themselves from society felt like the only way to survive. And the church, to its credit, sometimes protected them. Hermits were allowed to live outside the norms. They weren't punished for talking to themselves. They weren't labelled dangerous for avoiding eye contact. They were just holy, or odd, or both. Some even received official recognition from the church. The process of becoming a recluse could be formalised. You'd receive a blessing, be given a cell or anchorite's hut near a church wall, and be allowed to live in silence for the rest of your life. It wasn't considered madness. It was a vocation, a way to suffer in a way people respected. And here's your fringe fact of the night. There are documented cases of people being voluntarily bricked into small rooms, literally walled in, with a tiny opening for food and confession. These anchorites believed that spiritual perfection came from total isolation. Some of them lived that way for decades. One, an English woman named Julian of Norwich, became one of the most respected mystical writers of the age, all from her sealed cell. But not all hermits were officially sanctioned. Many just left. Slipped away after a funeral, vanished after a breakdown. Some were forgotten. Others became local legends, and occasionally someone would stumble across them in the woods and say they radiated peace, like they'd found a secret the rest of us weren't ready for. Back by the stream, Leontius finally looks at you, just once. His eyes are steady but distant. Then he closes them, as if even your presence is too much. You get it. This isn't a performance. He didn't come here to be watched. He came here to disappear without being punished for it. Modern scholars debate whether hermits were mentally ill or simply misunderstood. Some point to signs of depression, PTSD or psychosis. Others argue that in a society where privacy was scarce and expectations were crushing, withdrawal was a healthy response, a refusal to play a role you never wanted. And honestly, isn't that mental health in its own strange way? Knowing what you need, even if no one else understands it. You rise quietly, leaving a bundle of dried bread and herbs near his feet. You don't expect thanks. He won't speak. He won't write you a letter explaining his worldview, but you walk away knowing that whatever broke in him back in the village didn't kill him. It just moved him somewhere else. And you think about how today we might medicate that silence, or break it with questions, or call it maladaptive. But here, in this century, in these woods, it's accepted, even revered. A different kind of sanity, shaped not by norms but by trees and time. The path back is long and winding. As you walk, you catch yourself listening more closely to the leaves, the birds, the rhythm of your own breath. It's not silence, really. It's something deeper, a quiet that holds you instead of judging you. And in that quiet, you begin to understand why someone might choose it. Not because they've given up on the world, but because it's the only place where their mind can finally rest. You find yourself drawn back to civilization, but not the loud, chaotic bustle of the town square. Not the chanting priests or the herb women humming over boiling pots. No, this time you step quietly into the hushed stillness of a cathedral. Columns rise like trees, arching so high they vanish into shadow. The air smells of incense and old stone. Candles flicker along the aisles, and somewhere in the distance, a choir is warming up in slow, rising Latin tones. But you're not here to pray. You're here to look at the walls, specifically at the frescoes, carvings and stained glass windows that line this sacred space. Images that don't just tell stories of saints and sinners, but that sometimes, in flashes of strange honesty, try to capture something else. Madness. Medieval art didn't have the luxury of medical journals. There were no diagnostic diagrams or brain scans, but it did have expression. Wild eyes, contorted bodies, twisted postures. And when artists set out to depict madness, they did it in ways that were raw, terrifying, and oddly insightful. Walk down the left aisle and you'll find a stone carving of a man tugging his hair out, his face frozen in a grimace so intense it could only have been drawn from life. His mouth is open in an endless scream. Around his neck hangs a rope, not pulling tight but just there, like a promise not yet kept. No saint's halo, no demon wings, just a man unravelling. Keep walking and you'll see a stained glass panel with what looks like a jester kneeling before a king, but his smile is crooked, his eyes wide and swirling. A closer look reveals the king is weeping. It's an inversion. Who is mad here? The fool or the ruler? The artist doesn't tell you. They just leave the question glowing in coloured glass for the sun to answer. In another corner of the cathedral, there's a fresco painted decades ago of a woman floating, arms outstretched above a crowd of villagers. Her robes flow like mist, her eyes rolled back into her head. The caption underneath calls her a visionary, but something about her posture, the clenched fingers, the twist of her neck, reads more like seizure or spiritual ecstasy than serene revelation. You remember the mystics, the women who were both saints and sufferers, and you start to wonder how many of these visions were painted by people who'd never seen one themselves, but had certainly seen someone in the throes of something beyond understanding. Medieval art was often didactic. It was supposed to teach, to warn, to uplift. But embedded in those morals and messages are moments of raw humanity. Madness is never named outright, but it's there. In the margins of illuminated manuscripts where wide-eyed figures chase invisible creatures, in gargoyles frozen mid-scream, tongues lolling, eyes bulging, in altar panels where demons whisper into the ears of bishops while others scream silently at the sky, and let's not forget the hell mouths, those yawning, toothy pits painted with squirming souls inside, some weeping, some laughing, because nothing was more terrifying than a mind that had snapped. Here's your fringe fact of the night. In some manuscript illustrations, mental illness was symbolised by animals perched on the head, small monkeys, frogs, birds, sometimes whispering into ears, sometimes clawing at hair. These creatures weren't just decorative. They were the medieval shorthand for madness, for unclean thoughts, for the mind turned inside out. Today, we call them metaphors. Then, they were warnings. Artists used the tools they had, posture, colour, expression, to depict what couldn't be spoken. Madness was a riddle, a punishment, a divine mystery. But sometimes it was just suffering, and the artist knew it. You can see it in the eyes they painted, not wild, not possessed, just lost. That kind of empathy, even in a society obsessed with spiritual causes, is rare, but it leaks through the cracks of the frescoes in chipped paint and weathered stone. And then there's the question modern scholars can't quite answer. Were any of these artists depicting themselves? Did some of them wrestle with their own minds and pour that chaos onto parchment and plaster? There are no medieval artist diaries admitting to depression or visions, but it's tempting to imagine some monk tucked in a scriptorium, illustrating a marginal figure pulling its own face apart. Not because of a commission, but because it felt familiar. You stop before a triptych at the back of the cathedral, dusty with age. In the centre panel, angels battle demons above a field of soldiers, but on the far left, in a smaller scene almost no one notices, a man kneels alone under a tree, head in hands. No sword, no saint, just despair. A dog sits beside him, waiting. No explanation, no caption, just an image that hits a little too hard. This is the power of medieval art. It doesn't name mental illness, but it shows it. Not as a clinical chart, but as myth, as emotion, as fear and beauty tangled together. It doesn't say, this man is schizophrenic or this woman has epilepsy. It just says, look, this is what suffering looks like. Sometimes twisted, sometimes holy, sometimes heartbreakingly normal. As you leave the cathedral, light filters through a rose window above the doors, scattering rainbows across the floor. You pause for a second in the centre of it, letting the colours break across your arms like stained glass bruises, and you think about how, even in a world that explained madness through demons and divine punishment, someone still took the time to paint it. Not to fix it, not to fear it, just to acknowledge it, which back then might have been the closest thing to mercy. By now, you've wandered across fields, through villages, and into the twisted corners of medieval minds, but tonight, your path veers east, into the lands of minarets and golden libraries, where the scent of cardamom lingers in the air and the stars are mapped not just for prophecy, but for medicine. You're entering the Islamic world of the Middle Ages, and here, mental illness is treated with a very different kind of reverence, one that, in many ways, feels light years ahead of its European counterparts. You arrive in Baghdad, the 9th century city of learning, where libraries stretch like palaces and scholars debate over ink-stained scrolls late into the night. The House of Wisdom stands like a beacon in the centre of this golden age, drawing in thinkers, poets, doctors and astronomers from every corner of the Islamic Empire. And inside its walls, the mind is not just a battlefield of demons or a site for punishment. It's a landscape to be studied, mapped and gently cared for. You're taken to a Bimaristan, a hospital, but not the kind you saw in the West. This place hums with purpose. The air smells clean, cooled by flowing water channeled through tiled courtyards. There are plants everywhere, lemon balm, basil, rose, and the sound of trickling fountains competes with the soft pluck of a lute drifting from a distant room. This isn't a prison. It isn't even a holding cell. It's a place of recovery. Here, mental illness isn't called madness. It's not always divine punishment or demonic influence. It's often seen as a disease of the brain, just like fever is a disease of the body. And that shift in thinking makes all the difference. Doctors like Al-Razi, known in the West as Rhazes, and Ibn Sina, Avicenna, wrote extensive texts about emotional disorders, mood disturbances, even hallucinations. They documented symptoms, created treatments, and remarkably, acknowledged that trauma could impact the mind as deeply as infection could the body. Al-Razi even divided illnesses into categories, those of the brain's structure and those of the soul's imbalance. He described patients suffering from deep melancholy, hallucinations, obsessive thoughts, and irrational fears. And he treated them, not with bloodletting or chains, but with diet, music, baths, and conversation. Yes, conversation. Talk therapy in a protoform was practiced here centuries before it had a name. Doctors would sit with patients, ask about their memories, their fears, their dreams. They believed that sometimes the mind could be guided back to balance through reason, poetry, and beauty. Imagine that, a society that thought beauty could be part of the cure. In this hospital, you meet a physician who introduces himself not as a healer of bodies, but as a gardener of the soul. He's treating a man named Naim who hasn't spoken in days. Rather than restrain him, they've brought him to a room filled with light and music. Every morning someone reads poetry aloud, Rumi, Hafez, and sometimes verses from the Quran, not as exorcism, but as comfort. Naim listens. He doesn't respond, but he listens. And slowly, day by day, he's begun to speak again. This isn't fantasy. Records from the period describe Bimaristans with dedicated wards for psychiatric care. They had routines, treatment plans, even staff trained to soothe patients, not provoke or punish them. Some hospitals used aromatherapy, placing orange blossoms and mint under patients' pillows. Others used water features to create a calming soundscape. The intention was always the same, not to lock away the ill, but to bring them back. And here's your beautiful fringe fact for the night. In some Islamic hospitals, it was believed that the first step toward healing the mind was restoring the senses. That meant fresh air, soft textures, sweet smells, and gentle music. It sounds suspiciously like a spa, but it was medicine. Thoughtful, intentional medicine, in an era when others were drilling holes in skulls and calling it a day. Even more remarkable is the level of dignity afforded to the mentally ill. In Islamic jurisprudence of the time, people with mental illness were protected. They couldn't be punished for their actions while unwell. Their families were expected to care for them, not cast them out. In court, their condition was taken into account. And in theology, they were often viewed as spiritually innocent, closer to God in their suffering. Compare this to the European mindset, where madness was feared, shunned, and often silenced. The contrast is jarring. While one culture built dungeons and chained people in cellars, another built gardens and treated hallucinations with poetry. Of course, it wasn't perfect. Not every patient recovered. Some treatments were based on flawed ideas, imbalance of humours, phases of the moon, astrological charts. But the underlying attitude was radically different. The mentally ill were not monsters or sinners. They were sick and deserving of care. You sit for a moment in the courtyard of the hospital, watching a young boy with wide eyes trail his fingers through the water. A nurse gently guides him away when he starts to rock back and forth too quickly, and you realise something else. No one is afraid of him here. He's not called possessed. He's not a warning or a punishment. He's just a person, struggling and slowly healing. Modern historians debate just how widespread this compassionate approach was. Some say it was limited to elite urban centres. Others argue that the values it embodied were more common than we think, hidden in records yet to be fully translated. But one thing's certain. The Islamic Golden Age viewed the mind not as a battleground of good and evil, but as a delicate instrument that sometimes slipped out of tune, and could, with care, be played again. As the call to prayer rings out from a distant minaret and the sun dips behind the tiled rooftops, you feel something rare on this journey. Hope. Real hope. That even in a world lit by candles and scribbled on parchment, there were people who understood what so many still struggle to grasp. That mental illness is not a curse. It is not weakness. It is suffering, and suffering deserves mercy. As the sun dips beneath the horizon, casting gold over domes and date palms, you slip quietly away from the Bimaristan, your head still buzzing with the sound of flowing fountains and soft music. But you're not done. Not yet. The next leg of your journey takes you into the narrow, cobbled alleys of a different city, this time lit not with the promise of scientific healing, but by oil lamps swinging gently from iron hooks. You're entering a Jewish quarter in the heart of medieval Spain, and here, another chapter of mental health quietly unfolds, less grand than Baghdad's hospitals, but no less vital. You pass under a stone arch, duck through a wooden gate, and find yourself in a modest courtyard where voices rise and fall in Hebrew and Ladino. Laundry flutters overhead, and the smell of warm bread and roasted eggplant makes your stomach growl. But tonight, you're not here to eat. You're here to understand how the Jewish communities of the Middle Ages, scattered across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East, understood the soul in distress. Inside one home, you meet a scholar named Menachem seated on a low stool, reading aloud from the writings of Maimonides. By candlelight, the words come slowly, carefully. The physician should not treat the body without also treating the soul, and he should not treat the soul without understanding the condition of the body. It sounds almost modern, doesn't it? Maimonides, Rabbi Moses ben Maimon, physician, philosopher, and legal scholar, lived in the 12th century and wrote extensively on medicine. And in his world, mental illness was not a matter of demons or divine punishment. It was real, treatable, and, perhaps most astonishingly, worthy of deep compassion. Menachem explains that in Jewish law, the nefesh, the soul, is deeply tied to emotional and mental states. Illness of the soul is not a sin, it's a burden. And Jewish philosophy, particularly in the writings of Maimonides and his predecessors, made room for this suffering. They described depression, anxiety, even obsessive thoughts, though not in those exact terms. Instead, they spoke of sadness that grips the bones, of darkness in the heart, or of a mind that runs in circles and cannot be calmed. In this community, healing didn't come from one source alone. There were physicians, of course, trained in both religious texts and the medical works of the Greeks, Arabs and Persians, but there were also rabbis, counselors of the spirit, and in many cases those roles overlapped. The community turned to them not just for Torah wisdom, but for help with grief, fear, or strange behaviours that didn't make sense. You listen as an elderly woman speaks softly about her son, who has refused to leave his bed for weeks. He stares at the ceiling, she says, and says he's forgotten how to smile. No one suggests he's possessed. No one says it's a curse. Instead, the community visits him. They bring food. A rabbi sits beside him and reads psalms aloud. Another neighbour brings lemon balm tea and plays a slow tune on a wooden flute. They're not pretending to have the cure, they're simply showing up. And here's a beautiful truth. In many medieval Jewish communities, emotional suffering was understood as part of the human experience. There was no shame in it. In fact, some texts argue that deep sadness connects a person more closely to God, that the broken-hearted prayer reaches heaven faster than any other. But it wasn't just spiritual. Maimonides wrote about the balance of humours, like his Muslim and Christian counterparts, but he also emphasised moderation in everything: diet, sleep, even thoughts. He warned that excess worry could burn the blood, and that isolation worsened troubled spirits. He advised doctors to treat patients with warmth, to avoid fear tactics, and to listen more than they spoke. In his writings, mental health isn't separate from physical health. It's woven into every part of being alive. And here's your fringe detail for the night. In some medieval Jewish texts, dreams were considered diagnostic tools, not in the magical sense, but in the psychological. If a person dreamed often of water, it meant their emotions were rising beyond what they could hold. If they dreamed of climbing or falling, it reflected a fear of failure or divine distance. The dreamer wasn't shunned, they were counselled, asked about their fears, their regrets, their memories. You sit in on one such conversation, between a young woman named Sarit and her rabbi. She's been suffering from sleeplessness, and lately she's heard whispering voices at night. In another village, in another faith, she might be called possessed. But here, the rabbi asks her gently, what changed this year? Her father died, she says. She hasn't cried since. The voices began shortly after. The rabbi doesn't rebuke her. He listens, then prays quietly, not over her, but with her. Scholars today are still unpacking how much these communities understood what we'd now call psychological trauma. Some suggest that their frequent experiences with displacement, violence and persecution, pogroms, forced conversions, expulsions, gave Jewish thinkers a sharper insight into emotional suffering. Others believe the emphasis on education and communal responsibility simply created more language and space for subtle forms of care. But whatever the cause, the result is clear. Jewish communities, particularly during the Islamic Golden Age and into medieval Europe, created room for mental illness to exist without fear. Maybe not perfectly, but enough to recognise that a troubled mind wasn't a danger to be locked away. It was a soul in need of tenderness. As you leave the courtyard, the candles flicker in the windows and the scent of warm tea follows you. You hear laughter, soft, hesitant, but real, and you realise it's Sarit. She's sitting outside now, her mother braiding her hair, both of them humming a lullaby that's older than the stones beneath your feet. And for a moment you wonder if maybe understanding doesn't always need a hospital. Maybe sometimes it just needs presence, patience, and a language of care that speaks to the soul, not in theories or charts, but in whispers and warmth. You leave behind the warm glow of the Jewish quarter and step into a world that feels colder, stiffer, and a bit more obsessed with mystery wrapped in metal. The air smells like iron, smoke, and wet parchment. Alchemists, the medieval sorcerers of science and seekers of cosmic truths, are your next stop. You duck into a cluttered stone chamber lit by the sickly green flicker of lamp oil filtered through stained glass, and there, hunched over a pile of crushed minerals and ancient scrolls, is Master Alaric, High Priest of melting things down until they make sense, or until they explode. Alaric isn't just trying to turn lead into gold, though he wouldn't mind if it worked. He's also chasing something else. Balance. Harmony between body, spirit, and the world. And somehow, amidst all his beakers and dragon's blood, which is disappointingly just red resin from a tree, he's dabbling in early mental health theory, even if he wouldn't call it that. You sit down as he stirs a shimmering concoction that smells like vinegar and violets, and he begins to explain his theory of melancholia. This isn't just a mood, he insists. It's an imbalance of the elements, a misalignment of stars, a corruption of internal alchemical forces. Melancholy, to him, is the sadness of Saturn, the slow, creeping heaviness that lingers in the bones. It's the price some pay for being too close to the divine. Sound familiar? To medieval alchemists, especially those influenced by both Greek philosophy and Arabic medicine, the mind was a crucible, something that could be refined, shaped, purged. A melancholic temperament was associated with deep thinkers, scholars, artists, mystics. It wasn't just a medical condition, it was a spiritual identity. Alaric quotes the ancient saying, "Nullum magnum ingenium sine mixtura dementiae." There is no great genius without some touch of madness. And there you have it, the romanticization of suffering, a concept still very much alive today. In Alaric's world, a person haunted by strange thoughts, or consumed by dark dreams, isn't necessarily ill. They might be on the brink of revelation. They might be drawing too close to truths most people aren't meant to see. He pulls out a worn manuscript, fingers trembling with excitement, and shows you a diagram of the 4 humours mapped onto astrological signs. Melancholics are ruled by Saturn, cold, dry, thoughtful, withdrawn. They're most at risk for madness, but also most likely to see the face of God in a flame. The idea that mental suffering might be a necessary step toward enlightenment wasn't fringe. It was baked into alchemical philosophy. You meet another alchemist, a woman named Beatrix, hidden behind a veil and reeking of mercury. She shows you her soul mirror, a polished disc meant to reflect the inner self. "If you stare long enough," she says, "you'll see what poisons you." You stare. You see your own tired eyes. She nods solemnly. It's working. Beatrix treats mental afflictions with tinctures and rituals. She burns sulphur to chase out spirits of sorrow, crushes gemstones into powder to strengthen the heart, and insists that gold, if ingested properly, can cure nearly anything. She's wrong about that, obviously, but you admire the confidence. Here's your strange little fringe fact for the night. Some alchemists believed melancholy was caused not just by black bile, but by lead, yes, actual elemental lead, in the body. Since lead was the base metal they sought to transmute, it became a metaphor for the soul weighed down by impurity. So when someone was deeply depressed, they weren't just sad. They were leaden, heavy, incomplete, waiting to be turned into something better. Of course, there's a downside. Not all alchemists were gentle philosophers. Some experimented recklessly, on themselves, on apprentices, on animals. They inhaled toxic fumes, drank metals, isolated themselves for weeks. There's speculation that some of them may have been suffering from mercury poisoning, tremors, hallucinations, paranoia, which raises the question, were they studying madness or slowly sliding into it? You watch as Alaric carefully pours his glowing solution into a small iron bowl and mutters a prayer to Hermes Trismegistus, the mythical father of alchemy. "It's not madness," he says softly as the liquid hisses, "if it brings you closer to truth." That's the seductive part of all this. Alchemy gave suffering meaning. If you were sad, overwhelmed, fragmented, it was because your soul was being refined. You were being tested by the cosmos, cooked by God's fire, and maybe, just maybe, you were meant for something greater. Modern scholars roll their eyes at alchemy now, calling it proto-science or poetic madness. But a few have begun to revisit its philosophies through the lens of early psychology. Carl Jung famously drew on alchemical symbolism to explain the process of individuation, the transformation of the self. The stages of alchemy mirrored the stages of personal growth. Nigredo, darkness; albedo, clarity; rubedo, enlightenment. Translation: you have to break down before you build back up. You leave the workshop as the stars begin to prick the sky. Your cloak smells faintly of sulphur and lavender. In your pocket, Alaric has slipped you a tiny scroll. "For when your thoughts get too loud," he said, "it's a prayer, or maybe a spell, or maybe just nonsense, but it feels like something." And as you walk away from the glowing green windows, you start to wonder if maybe the alchemists weren't trying to change metal at all. Maybe they were just trying to survive their own minds. Maybe they understood what it felt like to be crushed under invisible weight, and instead of collapsing, they lit candles and started mixing potions. Not to cure madness, but to make it mean something. The alchemists fade behind you, along with their smoke-stained prayers and trembling glass, and for a moment, the path is quiet again. But it doesn't stay that way. The silence is broken by a voice, a low, gravelly sermon from a stone pulpit just over the next hill. It's a village priest, red-faced and sweating under his woolen robes, gesturing wildly as he speaks to a tense crowd. You stop just before the chapel entrance, catching the end of his warning. "The devil walks among us not in hoof and horn, but in the whisper of temptation, in the mind turned from God." And just like that, you're back in one of the darker corners of the medieval psyche. The belief that the devil, not biology, not trauma, not the relentless weight of living, was the source of mental breakdowns. Inside the chapel, candles flicker like guilty secrets, and painted saints line the walls, all grim faces and haunted eyes. The priest continues, pacing now, talking about the sin of despair. "To lose faith," he says, "is to invite the enemy into your soul." Around you, villagers shift nervously. Someone coughs. A woman clutches her child tighter. The implication is clear. Mental anguish is not just pain, it's moral failure. A crack in the wall through which evil can crawl. This idea wasn't new or rare. For centuries, mental illness was tangled up with theology, feeling hopeless. That was acedia, spiritual sloth, a sin so deadly it made the original list before pride and envy elbowed in. Hearing voices, probably the devil, obsessive thoughts, temptation. In this worldview, your mind wasn't your own. It was a battleground between salvation and damnation, with your sanity as collateral damage. You hear the priest talk about a boy from the next village who started mumbling strange phrases in the night. He was a good boy once, the priest says, but he let doubt fester. That's how the devil enters. The boy, you learn, was last seen being escorted to a monastery. Or was it a dungeon? No one says. Either way, he's gone. It's chilling, isn't it? The way the medieval church sometimes transformed mental illness into a morality play. But it was more than fear. It was a system of logic. When someone suffered in ways that didn't leave bruises or fevers, people needed answers. And in a deeply religious culture, the devil was always the most convenient one. Of course, not every cleric preached fire and brimstone. Some monks and theologians argued for compassion. They believed suffering brought people closer to Christ, that mental anguish was a form of divine refinement, but still the whispers persisted. If you despaired too deeply, if you doubted too loudly, if you refused to be cured by prayer, then maybe, just maybe, you weren't fighting demons. Maybe you were welcoming them, This fear bled into law, into daily life, into how people spoke to each other. You remember the woman you met in the herbalist's hut, muttering to herself as she crushed dried petals. She told you, almost proudly, that her sadness came from a spell. It wasn't hers, it was placed upon her. It's easier to live with your sorrow when you believe it isn't your fault, when you can point to a cause, a reason, a scapegoat with cloven hooves. And here's your fringe fact for the night. Some medieval penitential manuals, the spiritual equivalent of how-to confession guides, included sections on how to confess demonic thoughts. Priests were trained to distinguish between normal sadness and sinful despair. One such guide suggested that if a person repeatedly imagined death, they should sleep with a crucifix under their pillow and confess every single intrusive thought aloud, even if it made no sense, if the priest deemed it too dark. Well, the devil might be closer than anyone thought. You step back outside, away from the sermon, and into the cool night. The stars overhead seem indifferent to everything. The path ahead is lined with soft moss and broken cart tracks. You walk past a group of villagers whispering about a man who's been living alone since Easter, saying strange things. They want the priest to visit him, not with bread, not with counsel, with holy water. There's something deeply sad about it, the way fear disguised itself as righteousness, the way mental illness, already isolating, was treated like a spiritual infection. And yet, in the heart of all this suspicion, there was still the occasional flicker of mercy. Some priests did help, some offered silence instead of judgment. A few even argued that despair was a human condition, not a moral one. One such priest, Father Gerwin, kept a journal you read once, found in the ruins of a priory long forgotten. In it he wrote of a young woman who came to him convinced the devil was speaking to her in dreams. Instead of exorcising her, he simply listened. Night after night, he wrote, "If the devil lives in her, he fears her silence." Eventually she stopped having the dreams, or maybe she just stopped needing to explain them that way. Modern scholars still wrestle with this legacy. Did the Church's obsession with sin and demonic influence worsen the lives of those with mental illness? Most agree yes, but others point to those rare individuals, clerics who, constrained by dogma, still managed to show grace. It's a murky, complicated history, but then again, what part of the mind isn't? As you walk further into the night, you hear a soft chant rising from a nearby house. A lullaby, or maybe a psalm. A mother singing to her child who hasn't spoken all week. She doesn't mention demons, she doesn't mention sin. Just rocks gently, her voice steady. A different kind of prayer, one that doesn't ask for an exorcism, only peace. And maybe that's what people were always searching for. Not salvation, or gold, or cosmic alignment. Just a moment of quiet inside a storm that no one else could see. The path now leads you to a high-walled town where time seems reluctant to pass. A castle looms above crooked houses and tight alleys, casting long shadows that seem a little too still, a little too watchful. This isn't a place that welcomes outsiders, and yet your feet keep pulling you forward until you stand before a wooden door marked with an iron seal, a crescent moon carved into its centre. You've arrived at what can only be described as a medieval institution. Not a hospital, not a monastery, something in between, something called a fool's house. This isn't legend, these places existed. In parts of Germany, France and Flanders, you'd sometimes find small facilities tucked behind walls where people deemed mad or simple were taken, sometimes for care, sometimes for containment. Here the lines between sanctuary and prison blur so thoroughly you can't tell if you're entering a place of mercy or exile. The door creaks open and you're greeted by the steward, a man who calls himself Brother Till. He's not a monk, not quite a doctor either, more like a medieval social worker with a habit of chewing cloves and a slightly twitchy left eye. He waves you in without ceremony. Don't talk too loud, he warns. They don't all like noise. Inside it's dim and cold, the air thick with the scent of damp straw and lavender meant to cover something less pleasant. There are a few cots, some benches, and in one corner a woman quietly rocking herself, eyes shut, mouthing a song you can't hear. No chains, no cages, but no freedom either. You ask Till what this place is. We care for them, he says simply. Feed them. Keep them from hurting themselves, or others. You ask if there's treatment. He shrugs. Some get better, some don't. We pray. We keep them warm. that's all we know. This is the heart of the medieval approach to institutional care. Rudimentary, uneven, but not always cruel. Fools' houses or hospitals for the insane began appearing in the late Middle Ages, especially in more urban areas. They weren't common, and they weren't funded with enthusiasm, but they were the beginning of something, however imperfect. The shift from hiding madness in back rooms to managing it in public, semi-official spaces. You meet a young man named Ernst who won't meet your gaze. He carries a pouch of pebbles and names them like old friends. When he's distressed, he lies flat on the ground, arms at his sides, eyes locked on the ceiling. The staff doesn't stop him. They've learned he calms down faster that way. There's no diagnosis, of course, no label, just a quiet understanding. He needs stillness. Give it to him. In another room, a man speaks only in riddles. Till says he was once a poet, maybe a monk, but no one can be sure anymore. He sees too much, Till says. His mind broke open. He sits by the window, muttering about birds with human hands. You listen for a while. One of his riddles actually makes you laugh. He seems pleased. And here's your curious fringe fact. In a few of these institutions, particularly in Germany, residents were sometimes taken out for public walks, paraded through town, sometimes in jest, sometimes in pity. It was seen as a kind of reverse morality play. Here, the townspeople might say, is what happens when the mind slips from God. But occasionally, very occasionally, people also brought gifts, flowers, bread. Not everyone saw the mad as cursed, some saw them as blessed in ways no one else understood. This isn't Bedlam. Not yet. That comes later, with screaming cells and tourist tickets. Right now, in this flickering moment of the 14th century, the Fool's House exists in a strange limbo. Neither sanctuary nor hell. Somewhere between care and custody. You ask Till how long people stay. Until their family takes them back, he says, or they die. You glance around and wonder how many have been here for years. There are no clocks, no calendars, just routines. A bowl of porridge at dawn, prayers at midday, candles at dusk, and in between, waiting, wandering, whispering. Modern scholars debate the purpose of these institutions. Were they acts of charity, public safety measures, quiet dumping grounds? The answer is probably yes to all. Context mattered, wealth mattered. So did local superstition. In some towns, the Fool's House was treated with dignity, staffed by nuns or lay brothers who truly cared. In others, it was a convenient way to disappear in embarrassment. You speak with a woman named Isolde, whose husband was brought here after he began accusing the wind of stealing his thoughts. She visits once a month, brings him honey cakes, sings to him when he forgets her name. He wasn't always like this, she tells you, eyes brimming. He used to laugh so easily. You ask if she thinks he's still in there. Sometimes, she says, in the way he touches the edge of the table before he sits down, he always did that. And there it is again, that thread of humanity that refuses to break. Even here, behind stone walls and the label of fool, people remember who they love, who someone used to be. As you leave, Till walks you to the gate. It's not much, he says, rubbing the back of his neck, but it's better than the street, or the well. You know what he means. You've heard the stories. People who wandered too long. People whose families gave up. People who were left to walk into the forest and not return. That was the medieval reality too. The door closes behind you with a hollow clunk. Outside, the wind has picked up. You wrap your cloak tighter and head down the hill. Behind you, the Fool's House settles back into its hush, a place suspended between compassion and forgetting. And you think, for all its failings, it's still one step closer to what we're all trying to find, a safe place for a hurting mind to be seen. Not as a monster, not as a lesson, just as a person. The road begins to narrow now, its edges crumbling into tufts of grass and stubborn dandelions. You pass fewer carts, fewer people, just the occasional bird startled into flight and the rustling whisper of leaves shifting in the wind. It's quieter out here, lonelier. But that's fitting, because tonight you're walking into the minds that medieval society most feared, not just misunderstood or pitied, but actively rejected. This is where madness meets accusation, and where the lines between mental illness and witchcraft dissolve like smoke in candlelight. You arrive at a village that seems frozen in dread. The windows are shuttered even though the sun still hangs low in the sky, casting long gold bars through the trees. You hear murmuring, not chanting, not prayer, just the nervous, sustained buzz of people trying not to say the wrong thing. In the centre of town stands Post, a tall one, scorched at the base, and nearby, a woman in chains. Her name is Breda. She's older than she looks, her face sun-worn, hair braided into a thick grey rope down her back. She was accused of bewitching a cow. The villagers say it stopped giving milk the same day she walked past it with her hands tucked into her sleeves. That's it. That's the evidence. You ask what she actually did, and they say she talks to herself. You ask if she hurt anyone, and they say not yet. And there it is. The fear. Not of what she has done, but what she might do, or worse, what she might be. To them, Breda isn't sick, she's dangerous, she's other. A walking question mark with bad timing and worse habits. A woman whose silence is mistaken for spells, whose trauma is mistaken for evil. In this village, and many like it, mental illness often got swept under the terrifying rug of witchcraft, especially in women, especially older ones, especially those who were alone, outspoken, eccentric, or just unlucky. That nervous laughter you hear, it's not about humour, it's fear dressed up in the only socially acceptable clothing they've got. You ask Breda what she thinks about all this. She stares at you for a long moment, then says, "I talk to my dead husband because no one else listens." She doesn't cry. She doesn't plead. She just shrugs like someone who's watched the tide come in too many times to argue with it. The correlation between mental illness and witchcraft accusations was no accident. In medieval Europe, especially between the 15th and 17th centuries, the witch hunts became a convenient way to explain the inexplicable. A sudden illness, a failed crop, a miscarriage. Blame the woman who mutters under her breath or stares too long at the fire. And if she rocks back and forth at night, or laughs at nothing, or wanders into the woods barefoot, well, there's your confirmation. She's not afflicted. She is the affliction. You meet a man named Thorn, who once tried to save women like Breda. He was a minor official, now retired, who'd grown tired of watching frightened old women being burned for nothing. It wasn't justice, he says. It was fear with a badge. He tells you stories of women dragged into court because they spoke in rhyme, or because their dreams were too vivid. One woman was accused because she sat motionless in a chair for 3 days after her child died. She refused to cry, they said. She must have given the child to Satan. Some historians argue that many of the so-called witches showed clear signs of what we'd now call dissociation, schizophrenia, or deep depressive episodes. And because the church and the courts had no framework for mental illness, only for sin and sorcery, people like Breda were doomed before the first match was lit. Here's your dark fringe fact for the night. One of the tests used to determine if someone was a witch involved stripping them down, shaving off all their body hair, and inspecting them for devil's marks, moles, birthmarks, scars, or any spot insensitive to pain. That's right. If you didn't flinch when poked with a needle, say because you were numb from trauma or disassociation, it meant the devil had touched you. The horror wasn't just in the accusation, it was in the certainty. Once someone was marked as a witch, their madness became proof. Their suffering became strategy. If they cried, they were faking it. If they stayed calm, they were too calm. It didn't matter. The verdict came first. The logic was backfilled later. And of course, this wasn't exclusive to women. Men too were accused, but women bore the brunt, especially widows, healers, midwives, anyone who existed outside the tight mould of church-sanctioned roles. And if you happened to actually struggle with mental illness, you'd better hope no one noticed. You sit with Breda as the sun slips down behind the trees. The villagers are still watching, still waiting. Some are itching to call the magistrate. Others are just hoping the whole thing goes away without fire. You ask Breda what she wants. She looks at the sky. To sleep without dreaming of teeth, she says, then quieter. To not be afraid of myself. It's such a simple wish, and yet it was enough to get her chained to a post. Modern scholars today continue to argue about how much of the witch craze was fueled by actual belief, and how much by politics, property, and patriarchy. But for the women like Breda, it doesn't matter. The result was the same. They were left with no place to go, no language for what they felt, no system to recognise them as sick instead of sinister. As you rise to leave, you see a young girl step forward from the crowd. She offers Breda a crust of bread. Her mother pulls her back, whispering urgently, but it's too late. A little piece of humanity has been passed across that invisible line. Breda smiles just barely, and for a flicker of a second, the chain doesn't look so tight. Dawn has begun to pull gold threads through the sky by the time your journey starts to circle back toward where it began. The village fires are embers, the bells in the distant monastery echo like a yawn across the fields, and there's dew clinging to your boots. This time you're heading toward a place with no name, not a town, not a church, just a stretch of open ground beyond a crumbling stone wall where no one is supposed to go unless they have to bury someone no one wants. You're visiting the margins, the unmarked graves of the nameless and the mad. You climb over a tangle of dry brambles and step into the hollow. It's not large. There are no headstones, only lumpy rises in the soil, and the occasional splinter of weather-worn wood stuck like a toothpick into the earth. A thin fog hovers just above the grass, and you could almost miss it if you didn't already know what this was. This is where they buried the ones they couldn't explain. In the Middle Ages, if someone died in a monastery, they were buried in sacred ground. If they died with last rites, if they confessed their sins, if they belonged to the right class and wore the right shoes and had the right name, they were honoured. But if they died raving in the woods, or fell into a fit and drowned in a stream, or leapt from a tower after weeks of hallucinations, they were often buried in places like this, the potter's fields, the no man's land, the sinner's edge, and no one talked about it. No records, no mourning bells, just a quick, quiet hole in the earth, and a prayer mumbled under the breath, if that. You crouch beside a grave that's little more than a sunken patch of grass. Someone, long ago, placed a stone there, a smooth one, almost lovingly chosen. You run your hand over it. No carving, no initials. But someone remembered, even if they weren't allowed to say so. This is the part of the medieval story we don't hear much about. The ones who didn't make it. Not because they were wicked, but because they had no place to fit. The ones who suffered too loudly, grieved too long, laughed at the wrong time, believed voices no one else could hear. Many of them likely lived with what we'd now recognise as bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, chronic depression. But they didn't have words for those things. They just had names like mad, touched, lost, or nothing at all. One story survives from a 13th century English town, about a girl who wandered the woods barefoot every spring, singing songs no one else knew. When she stopped singing, they said the devil had taken her voice. She was found in a river days later. No one claimed the body. She was buried at the edge of pasture land. Her grave was marked by a sheep's jawbone. Another tale from a German hamlet speaks of a man who believed he could fly. He climbed a church tower during a thunderstorm and leapt. They said he laughed as he fell. They said he thought he was going home. The townspeople whispered about devils, but no priest would touch the body. He was buried in a ditch beside the road, where carts would splash mud over him for years. These stories survive only in fragments, letters, court records, marginal scribbles from monks with more compassion than they were supposed to have. But they tell us something essential, that mental illness wasn't just misunderstood, it was erased. You sit on the edge of the field as the sun burns away the mist. Birds begin to stir in the hedges. Somewhere in the distance a child is calling to a dog. Life continues, it always has. But here, in this quiet place, you feel the weight of everyone left behind by a world that didn't know what to do with pain it couldn't name. And yet, even here, you sense something tender. A few of the graves have flowers, wild ones, nothing planted. Someone cared, someone came back. Maybe it was a sibling, a friend, maybe someone else who saw too much of their own reflection in the empty spaces. There's something almost sacred about this kind of forgetting. Not because it's noble, it isn't, it's heartbreaking. But because it tells the truth. For every person who received care, who was prayed for, sung to, tucked into a cell with bread and balm, there were many more who simply slipped away. Too strange, too sad, too far from what the world called acceptable. Modern mental health professionals look back on this history with a mix of horror and sorrow, but also with a strange sort of awe, because buried beneath the failures and fears is something undeniable. People have always suffered in ways they couldn't explain, and other people have always tried, clumsily, desperately, sometimes cruelly, to help. You stand now, brush the damp from your legs and look back once more at the field. No sign, no fence, just grass and silence. And maybe that's enough. Maybe remembering them here, now, is the beginning of something better. Because when we talk about mental health in the Middle Ages, we're not just talking about old beliefs or outdated science. We're talking about real people. People who loved, who feared, who held on to scraps of hope even as the world pushed them out of view. And maybe they're not as far from us as we think. You take one last breath before turning to go, and in that breath, you carry every whispered name no one dared to write down. Not saints, not monsters, just human. You've walked a long road tonight, through stone cells and quiet gardens, past stained glass saints and muttering apothecaries, over graveyards that forget and paintings that remember. You followed the footsteps of people who weren't just ghosts in history. They were aching, breathing, laughing, breaking humans, navigating minds that wouldn't sit still in a world that barely understood what a mind even was. Now the path levels out. The woods fall silent. You feel the cool air on your face, and it smells like wet grass and distant firewood. The journey is ending, but it doesn't leave you empty. It leaves you full of questions, and if you've been listening closely, maybe a little more gentle toward the parts of yourself that still feel misunderstood. It's strange, isn't it? How much of what we call progress isn't about discovering something new, but about finally admitting what's always been true? That suffering doesn't make someone dangerous, that grief can outlast a season, that joy can live inside a mind still learning how to balance, and that healing isn't always loud or obvious. Sometimes it's someone whispering a psalm, or making space in a crowd, or not turning away. The medieval world gave us so many wrong answers, but buried in all that candlelit fear and superstition were glimmers of truth. That the mind is a mystery worth tending, that kindness isn't weakness, and that no one deserves to be abandoned just because they're difficult to understand. So tonight, as you close your eyes, carry this with you. The woman in the forest who found peace in solitude. The child who danced until his feet bled. The hermit who chose silence over madness. The alchemist who thought sorrow might be gold in disguise. The poet locked away with his riddles. The mother singing through the bars. They were all here. They were all real. And they still matter. Sleep well, dream kindly, and when the sun rises, carry a little of this softness with you into the world. Someone might need it. Maybe even you.